The COVID-19 pandemic brought unprecedented challenges to our member states and the people we serve. In response, the OAS Secretariat for Integral Development adopted a three-pronged approach by 1. Adjusting our portfolio of existing projects, 2. Exploring new projects to meet emerging needs, and 3. Expanding multi-sectoral partnerships. The results achieved in 2020 demonstrate the resilience of our member states and the commitment of the OAS SETI to work with member states and partners towards our common goals in the development of our region. Our Network on Competitiveness launched the COVID-19 Ideas Accelerator, sharing 250 tools, health solutions, responses, and recovery plans. The Network for Labor Administration published a portfolio of responses from ministries of labor to COVID-19, sharing over 420 measures taken to protect workers, employment, and income. Likewise, the Inter-American Teacher Education Network series, Teaching STEM in Quarantine, provided 117,000 teachers with key tools to continue advancing STEM education during the pandemic. Through its network and platforms, the Inter-American Committee on Ports promoted international and national best practices, guidelines, protocols, and recommendations on COVID-19 safety measures and continuity of logistic operations. Initiatives such as the Education in Times of Change platform allowed us to meet urgent needs by offering timely tools on virtual education and a dedicated space for ministries to share strategies, actions, and solutions. Other programs such as the Row Fund stepped up, providing emergency grants to offset the challenges imposed on our students by the pandemic. SETI's partnerships are adding value to member states in the form of technical assistance, training, and access to tools and services. In partnership with leading private sector institutions, we offered micro, small, and medium enterprises access to online tools and training, increasing their visibility and participation in e-commerce, a key to their survival and growth in the pandemic and post-pandemic era. A new OAS SETI Facebook initiative provided 85,000 MSMEs across the region with capacity building opportunities and WhatsApp business tools to aid response, recovery, and resilience building. The Caribbean Small Business Development Centers program achieved real impact, supporting new businesses, expanding sales, and driving growth. A new network of Caribbean SPDCs will broaden the program's reach. The Inter-American Committee on Tourism, the C2, convened ministerial-level policy dialogue in an urgent response to the impact of the pandemic on the hard-hit tourism and hospitality sectors. Policymakers and experts discussed biosanitary protocols, travel and visa facilitation, among other critical areas for the sector's recovery. Partnering with the George Washington University and the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, we went ahead with the scheduled first Indigenous Tourism Forum of the Americas, pivoting to a virtual format and convening over 240 participants from indigenous communities, the private sector, and governments. SETI also integrated sustainable development practices in the COVID-19 response. The pandemic is a daily reminder of the links between water, health, sanitation, food security, and nutrition. We ensured the continuity of our water management projects in the Plata Basin and worked with governments and partners in the design of an investment portfolio valued at $90 million. Additionally, the Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas continued to share relevant best practices and responses to the pandemic on energy and air quality. These few examples indicate our collective impact. We cannot do this alone. It is now more urgent than ever to address the region's structural weaknesses, to recover from the health, economic, and social crises occasioned by the pandemic and prepare for future shocks. It is imperative that we work together as we risk losing recent development gains and seeing millions fall back into poverty.
Listo. Vamos a español. Luis Valle, español. Segunda consola de español. ¿Bien, Neto? ¿Español? Ok. Listo. Portugués. Vamos a portugués. Sí, portugués. Portugués. 1, 2, 3. Portugués probando. No escucho a nadie en portugués. No escucho a nadie en portugués. Aló, escucho francés. ¿Quién está en francés? ¿En francés? Ok. Oh, ok. ¿Francés bien? Ok. Listo. Dale, dale. Perfecto. Amelie, buen día. Sí, excelente. Excelente, gracias. Esperemos por portugués, a ver. Bom dia. Perfeito, muito bem. Se escuta ótimo. ¿No? Ok, ok, melhor sim. Clarito. Bueno, a veces es conexión. Alô? Escuta melhor? Ok. Muito bem, muito obrigado. Listo.
Bueno, la CIM tiene una agenda enorme en el tema de democracia y de liderazgos. El primer ámbito tiene que ver con la gobernanza electoral, para que esta gobernanza electoral responda a las necesidades con las que fue creada, y es buscar los espacios de redistribución del poder. Después hay un programa interamericano sobre el liderazgo de las mujeres, donde generamos conocimiento y también tenemos cursos de capacitación. Hay un poderoso curso que ha llegado a más de 1000 mujeres con más de 15 ediciones, que es para candidatas electorales, en las cuales conversamos con ellas, pero también nos ponemos en una agenda de solidaridad y articulación y alianzas entre las mujeres, a pesar de las múltiples diferencias ideológicas o de partidos políticos. También hablamos de los temas de violencia política, porque no es lo mismo llegar que quedarse, y la violencia política es una forma de ejercicio de disciplinar a las mujeres para que vuelvan al mundo de lo privado y enfrentar la violencia, hacer buenas investigaciones, buenas leyes que permitan sancionar la violencia política. Es parte de las aspiraciones de la CIM en este programa de liderazgo de las mujeres. La aspiración histórica de las mujeres es estar en el mundo de lo público, que nuestro trabajo sea remunerado y que tenga un reconocimiento. COVID ha puesto en evidencia una profundización de las brechas existentes para el logro de este objetivo. Estas brechas existentes ahora dan cuenta de que podríamos tener un rezago de más de 2 décadas en el mundo laboral, que el cierre de brechas que se previó que podía tardar 100 años en cerrarse, ahora se habla de 135 años para cerrar la brecha entre los hombres y las mujeres. Entonces, nuestro objetivo es que miren el derecho de las mujeres al empoderamiento económico, que el statement "quédate en casa", que es un viejo conocido del patriarcado, no sea que nos quedemos en casa siempre, y que entendamos que la inserción de la mitad de la población, de este talento humano que tiene una serie de ventajas competitivas, es necesario para el crecimiento económico. De manera que la CIM está colocando esta realidad, está colocando las necesidades de las mujeres y está haciendo unas recomendaciones de rutas para poder cumplir con el derecho al empoderamiento económico y con el crecimiento económico que requieren nuestras empobrecidas economías en tiempos de COVID.
Hoy, esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos no podemos ser neutrales.
more than 100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
The COVID-19 pandemic brought unprecedented challenges to all member states and the people we serve. In response, the OAS Secretariat for Integral Development adopted a three-pronged approach by 1. Adjusting our portfolio of existing projects, 2. Exploring new projects to meet emerging needs, and 3. Expanding multi-sectoral partnerships. The results achieved in 2020 demonstrate the resilience of our member states and the commitment of the OAS SETI to work with member states and partners towards our common goals in the development of our region. Our Network on Competitiveness launched the COVID-19 Ideas Accelerator, sharing 250 tools, health solutions, responses, and recovery plans. The Network for Labor Administration published a portfolio of responses from ministries of labor to COVID-19, sharing over 420 measures taken to protect workers, employment, and income. Likewise, the Inter-American Teacher Education Network series, Teaching STEM in Quarantine, provided 117,000 teachers with key tools to continue advancing STEM education during the pandemic. Through its network and platforms, the Inter-American Committee on Ports promoted international and national best practices, guidelines, protocols, and recommendations on COVID-19 safety measures and continuity of logistic operations. Initiatives such as the Education in Times of Change platform allowed us to meet urgent needs by offering timely tools on virtual education and a dedicated space for ministries to share strategies, actions, and solutions. Other programs such as the Row Fund stepped up, providing emergency grants to offset the challenges imposed on our students by the pandemic. SETI's partnerships are adding value to member states in the form of technical assistance, training, and access to tools and services. In partnership with leading private sector institutions, we offered micro, small, and medium enterprises access to online tools and training, increasing their visibility and participation in e-commerce, a key to their survival and growth in the pandemic and post-pandemic era. A new OAS SETI Facebook initiative provided 85,000 MSMEs across the region with capacity building opportunities and WhatsApp business tools to aid response, recovery, and resilience building. The Caribbean Small Business Development Center's program achieved real impact, supporting new businesses, expanding sales, and driving growth. A new network of Caribbean SPDCs will broaden the program's reach. The Inter-American Committee on Tourism, the CTOUR, convened ministerial-level policy dialogue in an urgent response to the impact of the pandemic on the hard-hit tourism and hospitality sectors. Policymakers and experts discussed biosanitary protocols, travel and visa facilitation, among other critical areas for the sector's recovery. Partnering with the George Washington University and the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, we went ahead with the scheduled first Indigenous Tourism Forum of the Americas, pivoting to a virtual format and convening over 240 participants from indigenous communities, the private sector, and governments. SETI also integrated sustainable development practices in the COVID-19 response. The pandemic is a daily reminder of the links between water, health, sanitation, food security, and nutrition. We ensured the continuity of our water management projects in the Plata Basin and worked with governments and partners in the design of an investment portfolio valued at $90 million. Additionally, the Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas continued to share relevant best practices and responses to the pandemic on energy and air quality. These few examples indicate our collective impact. We cannot do this alone. It is now more urgent than ever to address the region's structural weaknesses, to recover from the health, economic, and social crises occasioned by the pandemic and prepare for future shocks. It is imperative that we work together as we risk losing recent development gains and seeing millions fall back into poverty. It is time for the region to redirect course and pursue a more sustainable, resilient, and equitable future for all. We are in this together.
But the resilience building agenda is too big for any one stakeholder to address acting alone, and simply bringing together stakeholders, whether at the national, subnational, regional, or global level, is not enough. Effective, focused, and sustained coordination among stakeholders is paramount to provide countries with integrated and comprehensive support.
The OAS, as a hemispheric forum and honest broker, must continue to facilitate this process while we work with member states towards the attainment of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Cooperation, collaboration, and partnerships that include all actors strengthen us, enabling us to be more than the sum of our parts. We can and we must work together. The future of our region depends on it.
Bueno, la CIM tiene una agenda enorme en el tema americano sobre el liderazgo de las mujeres, donde generamos conocimiento y también tenemos cursos de capacitación. Hay un poderoso curso que ha llegado a más de 1000 mujeres con más de 15 ediciones, que es para candidatas electorales, en las cuales conversamos con ellas, pero también nos ponemos en una agenda de solidaridad y articulación y alianzas entre las mujeres, a pesar de las múltiples diferencias ideológicas o de partidos políticos. También hablamos de los temas de violencia política, porque no es lo mismo llegar que quedarse, y la violencia política es una forma de ejercicio de disciplinar a las mujeres para que vuelvan al mundo de lo privado y enfrentar la violencia, hacer buenas investigaciones, buenas leyes que permitan sancionar la violencia política. Es parte de las aspiraciones de la CIM en este programa de liderazgo de las mujeres. La aspiración histórica de las mujeres es estar en el mundo de lo público, que nuestro trabajo sea remunerado y que tenga un reconocimiento. COVID ha puesto en evidencia una profundización de las brechas existentes para el logro de este objetivo. Estas brechas existentes ahora dan cuenta de que podríamos tener un rezago de más de 2 décadas en el mundo laboral, que el cierre de brechas que se previó que podía tardar 100 años en cerrarse, ahora se habla de 135 años para cerrar la brecha entre los hombres y las mujeres. Entonces nuestro objetivo es que miren el derecho de las mujeres al empoderamiento económico, que el statement quédate en casa, que es un viejo conocido del patriarcado, no sea que nos quedemos en casa siempre, y que entendamos que la inserción de la mitad de la población, de este talento humano que tiene una serie de ventajas competitivas, es necesario para el crecimiento económico. De manera que la CIM está colocando esta realidad, está colocando las necesidades de las mujeres y está haciendo unas recomendaciones de rutas para poder cumplir con el derecho al empoderamiento económico y con el crecimiento económico que requieren nuestras empobrecidas economías en tiempos de COVID.
Hoy, esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos no podemos ser neutrales.
more than 100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
The COVID-19 pandemic brought unprecedented challenges to all member states and the people we serve. In response, the OAS Secretariat for Integral Development adopted a three-pronged approach by 1. Adjusting our portfolio of existing projects, 2. Exploring new projects to meet emerging needs, and 3. Expanding multi-sectoral partnerships. The results achieved in 2020 demonstrate the resilience of our member states and the commitment of the OAS SETI to work with member states and partners towards our common goals in the development of our region. Our Network on Competitiveness launched the COVID-19 Ideas Accelerator, sharing 250 tools, health solutions, responses, and recovery plans. The Network for Labor Administration published a portfolio of responses from ministries of labor to COVID-19, sharing over 420 measures taken to protect workers, employment, and income. Likewise, The Inter-American Teacher Education Network series, Teaching STEM in Quarantine, provided 117,000 teachers with key tools to continue advancing STEM education during the pandemic. Through its network and platforms, the Inter-American Committee on Ports promoted international and national best practices, guidelines, protocols, and recommendations on COVID-19 safety measures and continuity of logistic operations. Initiatives such as the Education in Times of Change platform allowed us to meet urgent needs by offering timely tools on virtual education and a dedicated space for ministries to share strategies, actions, and solutions. Other programs such as the Row Fund stepped up, providing emergency grants to offset the challenges imposed on our students by the pandemic. SETI's partnerships are adding value to member states in the form of technical assistance, training, and access to tools and services. In partnership with leading private sector institutions, we offered micro, small, and medium enterprises access to online tools and training, increasing their visibility and participation in e-commerce, a key to their survival and growth in the pandemic and post-pandemic era. A new OAS SETI Facebook initiative provided 85,000 MSMEs across the region with capacity building opportunities and WhatsApp business tools to aid response, recovery, and resilience building. The Caribbean Small Business Development Centers program achieved real impact, supporting new businesses, expanding sales, and driving growth. A new network of Caribbean SPDCs will broaden the program's reach. The Inter-American Committee on Tourism, the C2, convened ministerial-level policy dialogue in an urgent response to the impact of the pandemic on the hard-hit tourism and hospitality sectors. Policymakers and experts discussed biosanitary protocols, travel and visa facilitation, among other critical areas for the sector's recovery. Partnering with the George Washington University and the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, we went ahead with the scheduled first Indigenous Tourism Forum of the Americas, pivoting to a virtual format and convening over 240 participants from indigenous communities, the private sector, and governments. SETI also integrated sustainable development practices in the COVID-19 response. The pandemic is a daily reminder of the links between water, health, sanitation, food security, and nutrition. We ensured the continuity of our water management projects in the Plata Basin and worked with governments and partners in the design of an investment portfolio valued at $90 million. Additionally, the Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas continued to share relevant best practices and responses to the pandemic on energy and air quality. These few examples indicate our collective impact. We cannot do this alone. It is now more urgent than ever to address the region's structural weaknesses, to recover from the health, economic, and social crises occasioned by the pandemic and prepare for future shocks. It is imperative that we work together as we risk losing recent development gains and seeing millions fall back into poverty. It is time for the region to redirect course and pursue a more sustainable, resilient, and equitable future for all. We are in this together.
But the resilience building agenda is too big for any one stakeholder to address acting alone, and simply bringing together stakeholders, whether at the national, subnational, regional, or global level, is not enough. Effective, focused, and sustained coordination among stakeholders is paramount to provide countries with integrated and comprehensive support.
The OAS, as a hemispheric forum and honest broker, must continue to facilitate this process while we work with member states towards the attainment of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Cooperation, collaboration, and partnerships that include all actors strengthen us, enabling us to be more than the sum of our parts. We can and we must work together. The future of our region depends on it.
Bueno, la CIM tiene una agenda enorme en el tema de democracia y de liderazgos. El primer ámbito tiene que ver con la gobernanza electoral, para que esta gobernanza electoral responda a las necesidades con las que fue creada, y es buscar los espacios de redistribución del poder. Después hay un programa interamericano sobre liderazgo de las mujeres, donde generamos conocimiento y también tenemos cursos de capacitación. Hay un poderoso curso que ha llegado a más de 1000 mujeres con más de 15 ediciones, que es para candidatas electorales, en las cuales conversamos con ellas, pero también nos ponemos en una agenda de solidaridad y articulación y alianzas entre las mujeres, a pesar de las múltiples diferencias ideológicas o de partidos políticos. También hablamos de los temas de violencia política, porque no es lo mismo llegar que quedarse, y la violencia política es una forma de ejercicio de disciplinar a las mujeres para que vuelvan al mundo de lo privado y enfrentar la violencia, hacer buenas investigaciones, buenas leyes que permitan sancionar la violencia política. Es parte de las aspiraciones de la CIM en este programa de liderazgo de las mujeres. La aspiración histórica de las mujeres es estar en el mundo de lo público, que nuestro trabajo sea remunerado y que tenga un reconocimiento. COVID ha puesto en evidencia una profundización de las brechas existentes para el logro de este objetivo. Estas brechas existentes ahora dan cuenta de que podríamos tener un rezago de más de 2 décadas en el mundo laboral, que el cierre de brechas que se previó que podía tardar 100 años en cerrarse, ahora se habla de 135 años para cerrar la brecha entre los hombres y las mujeres. Entonces nuestro objetivo es que miren el derecho de las mujeres al empoderamiento económico, que el statement "quédate en casa", que es un viejo conocido del patriarcado, no sea que nos quedemos en casa siempre, y que entendamos que la inserción de la mitad de la población, de este talento humano que tiene una serie de ventajas competitivas, es necesario para el crecimiento económico. De manera que la CIM está colocando esta realidad, está colocando las necesidades de las mujeres y está haciendo unas recomendaciones de rutas para poder cumplir con el derecho al empoderamiento económico y con el crecimiento económico que requieren nuestras empobrecidas economías en tiempos de COVID.
Entonces, okay. Okay, so we are ready to begin. And it's my great pleasure and delight to serve today as Master of Ceremonies for what is a very important moment, commemorating the historic March on Washington. And we're looking at this from the perspective of its legacy in the Americas. So the topic today for this program, the March on Washington, its legacy and impact in the Americas. So we're talking about 60 years of a legacy, and we have a number of officials and experts who will be speaking to this. My name is Ian Edwards, and it's my pleasure to be your Master of Ceremonies for this portion. So, without further ado, I shall invite our Secretary General, His Excellency Luis Almagro, Secretary General of the Organization of American States, who is here in person to deliver the opening remarks. So, Secretary General.
La marcha sobre Washington en 1963 es un punto de inflexión en la historia de Estados Unidos, cuando miles de afroamericanos y simpatizantes se manifestaron a favor de la justicia. Abrió los ojos de la gente, no solo en Estados Unidos, sino en todo el mundo, a las graves injusticias que todavía enfrentan los afroamericanos. El discurso que el reverendo Martin Luther King Jr. pronunció ese día no solo resonó entre los afroamericanos, sino que el mensaje viajó por todas las partes. Se convirtió en un llamamiento a los pueblos indígenas, asiáticos, latinos, latinas, así como a otros grupos que sufren discriminación racial y otras formas de discriminación. Muchas de las tácticas que el movimiento por los derechos civiles utilizó en las décadas de 1950 y 60, como las protestas pacíficas y la desobediencia civil, fueron adaptados por muchos movimientos sociales en todo el mundo en los años posteriores a la marcha y siguen utilizándose hoy en día, ya que la justicia social, la igualdad y el acceso a derechos siguen estando fuera del alcance de tantas personas en la región. La democracia es una meta, pero también es un proceso que evoluciona, igual que nuestras sociedades. Retrocede, progresa, se estanca, da saltos. Es algo que tenemos que trabajar con perseverancia y debemos permanecer siempre vigilantes para garantizar que la justicia social, la igualdad y la libertad, algunos de los principios clave de la democracia, nunca se tambaleen. En la OEA hemos estado comprometidos con el objetivo de cuidar la democracia. Prioridades que entonces no nos parecían tales están ahora al frente de nuestra agenda. A medida que el mundo va evolucionando, también tiene que evolucionar nuestra comprensión de la democracia, de cómo promoverla y protegerla, y de los derechos de las personas que componen esas democracias. En el pasado se entendía que en el centro de la democracia estaba el reconocimiento de los derechos humanos de los hombres que la componen. La interpretación de quién encajaba en esa categoría de hombres no está claramente definida a principios del siglo XX. Ahora sabemos que para que las democracias tengan éxito, esos derechos deben extenderse no solo a los hombres en el sentido binario, sino también a las mujeres y a los miembros de la comunidad LGBTQI+, los niños, las niñas, los y las adolescentes, los y las afrodescendientes, pueblos indígenas, otros grupos minoritarios raciales, nacionales, étnicos, migrantes, minorías religiosas, las personas con discapacidad, y la lista tiene que ser aún más larga. Y solo cuando todos y todas, cada una de las personas disfruten de todos los derechos que les corresponden, podemos decir que nuestras democracias están prosperando. Hasta entonces, seguiremos siendo obras en curso. Lo dice claramente el artículo 9 de la Carta Democrática Interamericana. La eliminación de toda forma de discriminación, especialmente la discriminación de género, étnica y racial, y las diversas formas de intolerancia, así como la promoción y protección de los derechos humanos de los pueblos indígenas y los migrantes y el respeto a la diversidad étnica, cultural y religiosa en las Américas, contribuyen al fortalecimiento de la democracia y la participación ciudadana. Los Estados miembros de esta organización se han comprometido a hacer frente al racismo y la discriminación donde quiera que se manifiesten, y varios apoyan una amplia gama de tratados de derechos para expresar su compromiso, como la Convención Americana sobre Derechos Humanos, el Protocolo de San Salvador, la Convención Interamericana contra el Racismo, la discriminación racial y otras formas conexas de intolerancia, la Convención Interamericana contra toda forma de discriminación e intolerancia. La Asamblea General también aprobó otras convenciones para abordar adecuadamente la discriminación que sufren diversos grupos, como la Convención Interamericana para la eliminación de todas las formas de discriminación contra las personas con discapacidad y la Convención Interamericana sobre la protección de los derechos humanos de las personas mayores. Para profundizar aún más en el abordaje de la discriminación, se elaboraron varios planes de acción que detallan medidas específicas para apoyar a los Estados miembros de la OEA y a la Secretaría General a crear espacios más inclusivos para que las personas de estos grupos puedan tener mejores resultados y contribuir de manera sustantiva a sus sociedades. Estos incluyen el Plan de Acción para el Diseño de los Afrodescendientes en las Américas, el Plan de Acción sobre la Declaración Americana sobre los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas, la extensión del Plan de Acción sobre la Declaración Americana sobre los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas, el Programa de Acción para el Diseño de las Personas por los Derechos y la Dignidad de las Personas con Discapacidad. Contábamos con todos esos instrumentos para proteger derechos de los desposeídos. Gracias a acciones de personas notables en el hemisferio, como el reverendo Martin Luther King Jr. El reto es que a medida que el mundo se vuelve más complejo y se ciernen crisis como la pandemia del COVID-19, la recesión económica mundial y la crisis climática, nadie que piense en los derechos de los demás que no sean los suyos propios, y los seres humanos volvemos los sentimientos de nosotros contra ellos para salir de alguna manera de las crisis. Por eso es necesario hacer una pausa y conmemorar acontecimientos como la marcha sobre Washington. El mensaje del Dr. King ese día fue claro: juntos somos más fuertes. Hoy, mientras celebramos el legado de la marcha sobre Washington, me gustaría recordar a los Estados miembros que aún no son parte de todas estas convenciones, que piensen en el mensaje del Dr. King y recuerden que solo cuando cada ser humano pueda alcanzar su pleno potencial y prosperar, nuestras sociedades en su conjunto irán mejor y todos disfrutaremos de los frutos de la democracia.
So thank you very much, Secretary General. Muchas gracias por la presentación que ha establecido para nosotros el ambiente en el que se ha desatado ese tema. Just to remind you all that we have interpreting services. The headsets are here for those who may not have had one and needs one in the 4 languages, and the channels are indicated on there. Next, we have a pre-recorded presentation from the Prime Minister of Barbados, Her Excellency Mia Mottley, and so we now have that recording instead of what the program had originally said was a minister from Brazil. So we will now have the recording from Prime Minister Mottley.
Excellencies and distinguished guests all, a very pleasant good morning. I want to commend the U.S. Permanent Mission to the Organization of American States in collaboration with the Secretariat and all other key stakeholders for organizing this very timely panel discussion, commemorating what was not just a major moment in American history, but indeed in world history. Thank you for allowing me to lend my voice to today's session. 60 years ago, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's Jr. I Have a Dream speech reverberated around the world. Today, we can scarcely have any conversation about racial justice without his words, whether consciously or unconsciously, echoing in the back of our minds. Today, we do indeed continue to hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. We continue to believe fervently in Dr. King's dream, a dream which I believe is that of every marginalized, disenfranchised, or otherwise oppressed group around the world. But regrettably, in light of the extreme poverty being faced by millions across the globe, the increasing north-south economic and developmental imbalance, racism, a looming climate crisis exacerbating all of the above, for many, all of this is still but a dream, and for some, a dream deferred. My friends, I am here to say to you that even if it is deferred, and even if you have not attained it, the dream must still be kept alive. I refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. I refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity. If we are to hold true to the belief that all of us are made equal, then we must come to accept the wrongs that have been done and with purpose and scale, move to address them. They say progress is a process. On the 1st of August, Barbados and the English-speaking Caribbean observe Emancipation Day. This is the day we commemorate the abolition of slavery across the English-speaking Caribbean. The Western world's history of exploiting the Caribbean and Latin America for that part is well documented. In Barbados, we bear the unfortunate responsibility of being the model slave economy that England would go on to replicate across the Americas, indeed including in your own country in the 17th century. This is the foundation upon which our nation states in the Caribbean regrettably were built, where the exploitation, oppression, and subjugation of an entire race of people forms the bedrock of our history, only to be further compounded indeed by the other acts of inhumanity perpetrated against Native Americans and indeed the indentured servants that were brought to this region. But you see, my friends, I believe the spirit of fairness, justice, and equality that drove Dr. King also guides us as people today. And it is for that reason that we cannot, as a society, continue to allow discrimination of any kind to persist. We know what it is like to feel the sting of prejudice. Here in Barbados, we know what it's like to be at the historical origin of discriminatory frameworks. But we too call upon the ethos of that I have a dream speech and reflect the call for fairness in our Constitution and indeed in the Charter of Barbados, which was passed only recently when we became a republic. Yes, my friends, the impact of that event and Dr. King's words still amplify a message that we in the Caribbean desperately need to hear and hold on to. Indeed, most of us in the global south need to hear it and hold on to it. For while the dream for a world without discrimination may be delayed, may be deferred, it cannot be abandoned. My friends, we must continue the fight for fairness and justice, no matter how difficult the times may get. And we must continue for the pursuit of solidarity. So, as we gather here today, let us continue to confront the systemic injustices that persist in our societies. Let us use the lessons from the March on Washington to compel us to work tirelessly towards dismantling the structures that perpetuate inequality, discrimination, and prejudice. Let us ensure that the spirit of fairness, justice, and equality, which Dr. King displayed in abundance during that 1963 March on Washington, let that continue to light our way forward. May we together carry the torch of unity, ensuring that the legacy of the march remains an inspiration for generations yet to come. And just as the voices of those who marched in 1963 reached across time and space, may our actions today resonate with the same passion, the same determination for a brighter and more equitable future. Why? Because our people have labored under oppression, hypocrisy, and discrimination for simply too long. Now is the time to start to turn the course of history in ways that will affect not just those of us who took that early train, but all of our people who have done nothing to deserve this inhumanity. I thank you.
Yes, those words delivered as eloquently as she could, the compelling speaker, the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley. So she gave an overview of the fact that we still need to keep this dream alive. The dream can never be abandoned. And we had heard from the Secretary General in terms of the hemispheric context at the OAS and some of the legacies. So it is my great pleasure now to introduce His Excellency Frank Mora, the Permanent Representative and Ambassador of the United States to the Organization of American States, who is in person to give us the perspective. Ambassador.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. We were just talking. It's hard to go after Mia Motley, but I will do my best. I want to thank the Secretary General for his remarks, and of course, Prime Minister Motley for her very compelling remarks as well to set the stage for today's discussion. Good morning to my colleagues, other permanent representatives, delegations, and everyone who's joining us here virtually. Good morning, welcome, and thank you for being here. As you know, today we commemorate the words and actions of Dr. Martin Luther King. His calls for racial equity and dignity for all people. And of course, his movement to end segregation and counter prejudice in the United States, and indeed. In his life, Dr. King developed close connections throughout the Americas. He visited Argentina, the Bahamas, Brazil, Canada, Jamaica, Mexico, and Venezuela. The Bahamians proudly point out that Dr. King wrote his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech while visiting their country in 1985 on a return trip, and on a return trip in 1968, he wrote his sanitation worker speech. And yet it is unfortunate that some 60 years later, the United States, like most other countries, is still struggling to end discrimination and intolerance, and continues to witness hate crimes against people of African descent. My government acknowledges that systemic racism and white supremacy are ugly poisons that have long plagued the United States. And we are committed to dismantling discrimination in our country. Because, and as Maya Angelou once said, history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived. But if faced with courage, need not be lived again. So colleagues, as many of you are aware, the United States has made racial justice and equity an urgent priority. Promoting across the federal government, making it central to domestic policies and programs, and weaving it into our foreign policy, including our engagement here at the OAS and at the United Nations. Last year, the United States strongly supported the creation of the UN Permanent Forum for People of African Descent, because we recognize the need to get at the root of the challenges and address the structural racism. The United States is committed to advancing equity, racial justice, and opportunity for Black Americans here and at home. Here at the OAS, here in the Americas, and of course here at the United States. As well as for people of African descent, indigenous peoples, and members of other marginalized communities around the region, as we continue striving to realize America's original promise and face up to its original sin. President Biden is building a federal government that looks like America, appointing Black Americans to key positions in his administration, including the first ever special representative for racial equity and justice, Desiree Cormier-Smith, who joins us here today. I'm pleased that Desiree is joining us and thank her for her service to promote these issues regionally and globally. Furthermore, while the U.S. government hasn't always gotten it right, our civil society has always been a source of pride and inspiration for oppressed people around the world. The United States has a robust and diverse civil society that calls us to task, with whom we at the U.S. Mission at the State Department regularly engage. Colleagues, the United States was founded on an idea that we are as Mia Motley alluded to, all created equal and deserve to be treated with respect and dignity throughout our lives. It is a promise we have never fully lived up to, but one that we will never, ever walk away from. The long shadow of slavery, Jim Crow, and redlining, and the blight of systemic racism that still dominates our nation today, hold America back from reaching its full promise and potential. But by facing these injustices openly and honestly, and working together as one people to deliver on America's promise, we become a stronger nation, a more perfect version of ourselves. We are a multicultural society, and one of the best ways for us to honor those who were enslaved is to spread awareness of their struggle, recognize the indispensable contributions made by people of African descent to build and develop our country, and to celebrate also the culture and traditions of the African diaspora. On August 31st, we have another opportunity for this reflection during the International Day for People of African Descent. As Frederick Douglass once said, and Frederick Douglass, a committed abolitionist, diplomat, intellectual, he said, and I quote, "Without a struggle, there can be no progress." Douglass served as U.S. ambassador to Haiti, and in that role, he embraced inter-American cooperation, coupled with effective and egalitarian development. The need for this cooperation in our region must be urgent, and nowhere more so than in Haiti today. We also know that despite all the progress we made in my country and throughout the region, inequality still remains one of the most pressing and shared challenges of our time. Unequal access to resources fueled by systemic discrimination not only harms individuals, but also slows our collective development. Simply put, when we lift each other up, we are all lifted up. As Dr. King put it so well, and I quote, "We must use time creatively and forever realize that the time is always right to do what is right." To this point, achieving racial equality and support for undeserved communities cannot be a one-off tactical project. It must be a multi-generational commitment, and it must remain the responsibility of all governments across the Americas. Through this work, we can bridge the gap between the world we see and the inclusive future we all seek. This is why we are committed to following up on the outcomes of last year's Social Development Ministerial held in the Dominican Republic, the Los Angeles Declaration on Migration and Protection, and the 2022 OAS General Assembly's Declaration of Lima, and why we support the ongoing work of the Inter-American Commission on Women, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and the Secretariat for Access and Rights and to Rights and Equity, and serve as a proud member of the OAS core groups on disability and LGBTI rights. On this, I would be remiss if I did not recognize an indispensable force behind the civil rights movement and the chief organizer of the March on Washington, Bayard Rustin. An openly gay man, Rustin was synonymous with the movement for the hundreds of thousands who were bused to Washington, organizing the march in an 8-week period without cell phones, without email, without even faxes, if you all remember what that was. The idea that all people should have what they need to live further motivated the Poor People's Campaign, organized in 1968 by Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and carried out under the leadership of Ralph Abernathy in the wake of King's assassination on that April. Here in the Inter-American system, the ongoing desire for economic justice and equitable social development is reaffirmed in our various human rights conventions and in the second clause of the Democratic Charter, which informs so much of the work we do here at the OAS. And I remind you by stating, democracy is essential for the social, political, and economic development of the peoples of the Americas, end of quote. This continues to ring true today because it commits the Americas to advance a development model which is democratic and asserts that development in its truest forms can only happen through democratic processes. So, as we celebrate the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington this week, let us all recommit to the fight for equity, opportunity, and dignity to each and every human being in equal measure. It is a call Dr. King made to all of us, and even now, 60 years later, is a call we must all strive to achieve in all our countries and in all that we do. I look forward to the discussion today and thank all the speakers for their valuable contributions to make this event a success. Thank you very much. The March for Justice and Equality continues, and we are all active participants in it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador Mora, as his concluding words that the march continues because, as we know, justice and these issues are not a destination, it's an ongoing. We never fully accomplish it in one go. I just wanted to give a little background that now that we've had the introductory remarks and the opening session, the whole purpose of this gathering is that in exploring the enduring message of putting an end to employment discrimination, civil rights abuses against people of African descent, Latinos, and other disenfranchised groups by eliminating discrimination and promoting equity and social inclusion. The hope is that this event will have brought to the fore some of the other issues and will give us a sense that some progress has been made, but still there is work to be done. So the session today has been divided up into presentations giving a historical overview of the march, and then we have the impact of the march in the USA and in the Americas, and a panel discussion as well on efforts to address racial discrimination, all forms of discrimination and intolerance. And of course, we never just talk about the problem, we have to talk about the way forward, as that second panel will help us understand. And just a reminder for those who are online that the program, you obviously by now would have figured out that you can follow it in the language of your choice and on the live webcast. So now we shall move into another gear with a presentation, historical overview of the March on Washington, and this is a 15-minute segment. We first have a video that will introduce, and then we have, I will introduce the presenter, Mr. Arturo Valenzuela. So, do we have the video ready? Anyway, it seems that the video is
Pleasure now to present the moral leader of our nation, one who has conducted a massive moral campaign in the southern area of the nation against the citadel of racism, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
Thank you, Mr. Randolph. I would simply like to say that I think this has been one of the great days of America. And I think this march will go down as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, demonstrations for freedom and human dignity ever held in the United States.
Okay, so I think that's the video. So now we have Professor Emeritus of Government and Foreign Service at Georgetown University and the former United States Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, Professor Arturo Valenzuela. And I think we have his presentation on video as well. So I'll get out of the way.
Thank you very, very, very much for inviting me to participate in this commemoration of the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington. I was a student at the time as an undergraduate at Drew University in Madison, New Jersey. And many of my fellow students were very keenly aware of the challenges of the civil rights era and wanted to participate, as we did, in our local community, trying to make sure that, in fact, local establishments did not discriminate against certain individuals in the community. So we worked very hard on that. But in some ways, what changed my perspective on this was joining the local chapter of Americans for Democratic Action at my university. Americans for Democratic Action was a national liberal organization with some very significant founders that joined the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. And it was a leadership conference on civil rights with all of these member organizations that in fact pushed forward at that particular time to try to see whether in the Kennedy administration and later the Johnson administration would enact a civil rights law. That was the key issue at the time. Now, when the March on Washington approached, I was actually with several fellow students from several universities at Swarthmore College at a gathering to discuss a whole series of human rights issues, not just in the United States, but also overseas. Later, Congressman Allard Lowenstein participated at that time, and he'd written a book on Southwest Africa called Brutal Mandate, talking about the challenges to human rights in that particular part of the world. But at this conference, we decided, all of us students, that we really needed to get to the March on Washington. So the organizers very kindly, hired a couple of buses, and we drove all the way down to Washington, getting there exactly in time so that we could be close to the Lincoln Memorial and listen to Martin Luther King's extraordinary speech at the time. So that really motivated us to continue to try to work on those sorts of things. In my own case, what I did was I eventually ran for office and became the National Vice Chairman of the Campus Division of Americans for Democratic Action. And in that role, what I was able to do was to work very closely with sync. In fact, we created something called the Liberal Study Group that made presentations at the National Student Association conventions together, Campus ADA and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and also had the experience of going south on some of the freedom rider efforts at the particular time. So in sum, this was an extraordinary experience for us. It was an iconic movement. It led me to become more involved in the civil rights movement, as I just mentioned. And I also decided at that particular time to spend some time in Washington writing my honors thesis as an undergraduate at Drew University on the Civil Rights Act, which led me to, in fact, speak to some of the key leaders, both in the House and in the Senate. What helped me do that was that as the vice president of the campus division of Americans for Democratic Action, I was also on the Americans for Democratic Action National Board, where Senator Hubert Humphrey was a member, where Senator Morris was a member, where Senator Clark was a member. And so these were extraordinary leaders from the time. So, but if it hadn't been for the March on Washington, it kind of just opened up all of our channels of communication to be able to work for the adoption of civil rights in the United States. At some point, I'm going to go back and look at my undergraduate thesis and see what I actually wrote about in terms of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I haven't had time to do that, but I will look at that soon. Again, for me, an enormous privilege to be able to join this commemoration and to describe how it impacted me and so many people of my generation.
Okay, so that presentation from Professor Valenzuela. I see that there was supposed to be another video. We ready to go with the other video? Okay. And then after that, we have the first panel on the impact of the march in the USA. But before we go to that, as we go along, we add some more information. Just to acknowledge that this session was a collaboration between the Permanent Mission of the U.S. to the OAS and the OAS Secretariat through the Department of Social Inclusion, which is under the Secretariat for Access to Rights and Equity, and other stakeholders, including the Ministry of Equity of Colombia, the Ministry of Racial Equality of Brazil, the Inter-American Network of High Authorities and Policies for Afro-Descendant Populations, RIAFRO, and the International Institute on Race Equality and Human Rights, and the George Washington University Law School. So the panel and the other segments we see here are the result of that collaboration. So I just thought it's useful for us to know this. So we'll have the video next.
I have a dream.
Martin Luther King Jr. is celebrated as a champion for civil rights. But today, I want you to think about a different part of my dad's legacy. Something that you may not know, but it's more relevant today than ever. His fight against poverty and income inequality.
But if a man doesn't have a job or an income,
He has neither life nor liberty, nor possibility for the pursuit of happiness.
When my father was shot in 1968 in Memphis, he was crusading for higher wages for black sanitation workers. Their work conditions were abysmal. Low pay, no sick leave, and many were on welfare. In a speech to the workers, Dad said the issue is injustice. The issue is the
refusal of Memphis to be fair and honest in its dealings with its public servants.
Today, my dad is revered, but in 1968, he was deeply unpopular. 2/3 of Americans disapproved of him.
Oh, I've been hit so many times, I'm immune to it.
The FBI said he was a communist, but he kept protesting anyway. I traveled with him as a kid throughout Georgia in preparation for the Poor People's Campaign. The idea was to rally people to Washington to press the federal government to provide jobs and income for the poor. This was his other dream, but he did not live to see it come to fruition. I think if my father saw the issues of poverty and income equality that exist today, he would be greatly disappointed. Back then, 25 million people were living in poverty. But today, it's close to 40 million, and some say it's much higher, while billionaires pay a lower tax rate than the working class. Americans who teach our kids, deliver our food, drive our buses, are struggling.
It is a crime for people to live in this rich nation and receive starvation wages.
If we really want to celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day and the principles that my father stood for, our whole government needs to step up from creating a cabinet position focused on fighting poverty to passing a universal basic income.
There's nothing new about poverty. What is new is that we now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty. The real question is whether we have the will.
Dr. King. In fact, the King Center is one of the collaborators in the presentation of this program, as is Howard University and the NAACP in organizing this session here. So we change gears now and we go to the first panel, the impact of the march in the USA and in the Americas, a half-an-hour segment. And this segment allows us to mix in-person with virtual. So in person we have my friend Carlos Quesada, and I do believe that you have your place of honor here, sir. And Carlos Quesada is the executive director and founder of the International Institute on Race, Equality, and Human Rights. Justin Hansford is a member of the UN Permanent Forum for Peoples of African Descent in person, and we're honored to have him in person, because initially there was a sense that it may have been not in person. Robert Cottrell, the Harold Paul Green Research Professor of Law and Professor of History and Sociology, George Washington University, in person. So welcome. And we have virtually engaging with this session, Jerome Tilok Singh, Senior Lecturer, Department of History at the University of the West Indies at St. Augustine Campus, Trinidad and Tobago, and his participation is virtual, and this session will be moderated by our Director of the Department of Social Inclusion, Matilde Munoz. Matilde.
Okay, thank you so much, our dear Master of Ceremony, Ian Edwards, and everyone for joining this event. I think we've had an excellent context with the presentations that have preceded this panel. And what we want to do in this second part of the program is to go a bit deeper in understanding the impact of the march, the legacies, and really to look forward, to see what's pending in the agenda for racial equality, income inequality, and really inequality writ large if we're talking about the region. So what we are going to try to do in this 30-minute panel, we have a very small amount of time, is to assess how the march impacted race relations in the United States, also in other countries of the Americas, and including the angle of the Anglo-Caribbean, and how the way we're going to proceed is that we're going to have a very brief reflection on these points by our four panelists, and then I'm going to follow up with a question or two on these points. And for that, they've already been introduced. We have Carlos Quesada from Race and Equality, Professor Cottrell from George Washington University, also a partner in this event, Professor Hansford, who's also going to give us the view, perhaps a global perspective really from the angle of the UN Permanent Forum for People of African descent, and also Professor Tillotson, who joins us virtually from West Indies University. So let's just start with very quick points of reflection on the impact of the march, and then we're going to proceed with the discussion. Carlos, let's start with you.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, it's an honor to share this panel with Professor Cottrell and Justin Hansford. So very, very happy to see you here. I would like to mention two things to start with. One is the context in which the march happens, and what happens in the United States, it was not isolated. It was part of a global movement too. And I think the US ambassador actually mentioned when he traveled to Latin America, Dr. King was able actually to see things firsthand of what was going on in Latin America, one thing. But the other thing is that we need to remember that the international context in the 1960s in the world. The majority of the English-speaking Caribbean countries were not countries. They were still colonies, for once. The majority of the sub-Saharan African countries were still colonies, and we have to remember that the independence period in Africa started in 1957, and it went all the way until the late 60s. So we have to see that in context. It's part. When people talk about globalization, I would say that the anti-racist movement was one of the first globalization movements that was inspired by anti-colonialism, but also the fight against racial discrimination. And there is another aspect here, very, very important during the 1960s, and it's the whole apartheid situation in South Africa too. And it was seen at the international level, and it's still as a black and white thing when we talk about racial discrimination. And we know today that it's more than that. And the second element that I would like to mention here is the context in Latin America in the 1960s. I mean, we had military dictatorships in a lot of countries in Latin America. Starting for instance, Brazil. We have a long dictatorship in Brazil that started in 1964 until 1985. So we had, when you talk about the impact of the legacy of Martin Luther King, you have to see that in perspective. What happened with the Afro-Latino movements? We didn't have the possibility to go to the streets and to fight for our rights. Simply. Brazil is the perfect example of it. So the seed of the message was there, but the fruition to the seed came after the democracy started in the region, and that happened in the mid-1980s. So that's when you started to see in Latin America, especially in Latin America, the Afro-descendant movement or the LGBTI movement or the women's movement, because before that, what we were fighting for in Latin America was for democracy, human rights, respect for human rights, and free elections. So when I say that the message came late, I'm not saying that there were not Afro-descendant movements in Latin America. I'm just saying that the struggle was different. We were focusing on different things. Brazil has newspapers for black people. You know, there were black clubs, clubs for black people, etc. But politically speaking, we didn't have the right to fight for our rights simply because there was not democracy in the majority of countries of Latin America. So I would stop here and then I can continue with other things.
And now? Yes. Well, I like that analogy of the seeds. The seeds were planted, and then later on, when the context changed and it was possible to go out and march and fight for this agenda, you know, we started to see results. But we're going to talk a little bit more also about our obstacles to that activism a bit later. So let's go to you, Professor Cottrell, and perhaps your angle as a legal scholar on the impact of the march and maybe also the connection to the civil rights movement and how we see that, you know, before but also today.
Okay, well, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to speak here. It's a great honor, and I've very much followed the work of the OAS in promoting human rights in the hemisphere. I'm a legal scholar, but I'm also a historian, and that always causes me to take the somewhat long view of how things got to be the way they are. One of the things I think we have to realize about the March on Washington is that it added a new vitality to a movement that was already nearly 200 years old. The American Civil Rights Movement, the quest to, in fact, gain full and equal citizenship for people who had been in what became the United States from the nation's beginning, indeed before the nation's beginning. It was a movement that I would say started in the northeastern United States with free Negroes in states like Massachusetts who said, why don't black men have the same right to vote that others do? We fought in the Revolution. We should have the same rights as our counterparts. And at least in the limited area of Massachusetts, they were able to gain such. Then you have the movement developing again after the Civil War. And one of the interesting things about the civil rights movement that is catalyzed by the March on Washington is that in many cases it simply regains rights on a federal level that had actually been established in the 1860s and 1870s. That is, we think of the 1964 Civil Rights Act bringing in the anti-discrimination principle, and yet that indeed was established by the Civil Rights Act of 1875, only to be struck down by the Supreme Court on rather spurious grounds in 1883. Or the idea that the federal government can protect one against mobs was put forward in the Enforcement Act of 1870, once again to be struck down by Supreme Court action. So this is, the March on Washington brings a new vitality to a movement that was indeed some 200 years old. And I think we want to put it in that perspective. But I think also what's important about the March on Washington and the revitalized civil rights movement that it brings about is it becomes a wake-up call to people of African descent and people of European and indigenous descent throughout the hemisphere. I think through much of the 20th century, many people in Latin America could be comforted by the fact, well, we don't have this kind of formal segregation, this Jim Crow that exists in the United States. We're not like those Americans. We are a racial democracy. One of the interesting areas where that actually manifested itself was during World War II. Brazil played a major role on the Allied side in the Second World War, something that is all too often forgotten. And Brazil sent an infantry division and an air group to fight in Italy. And one thing that Brazilians of that generation and who had that experience frequently said, the United States sent segregated divisions to Italy. We sent an integrated division to Italy. And it was a point, and a justifiable point, of national pride. But that lack of formal segregation masked significant structural and personal inequalities and racism in Brazilian society and in other Latin American societies. But what happened was, I think that the March on Washington and the civil rights reforms that it helped bring about caused people in Latin America to say, well, we need to look at this idea of racial democracy again. It's not quite what it seems. We need our own civil rights movement addressing our own difficulties and problems. And so in that way, I think the civil rights march, the March on Washington, played a major role not only in bringing about significant advancements in the United States, but causing people throughout the hemisphere to look anew at questions of race and inequality and social exclusion, and with significant legal reforms in many cases that came in the wake of that reconsideration.
Much for the lesson in history, but also the assessment on the impact in other countries of the region, and I think we can still see that today. We're going to talk about also, and I will ask you, looking forward, what lessons we've learned and how these can be useful for new impetus in terms of racial equality, the racial equality agenda in the region. I'm going to go to you, Professor Hansford, to share your initial remarks and then continue the conversation.
All right, thank you. I also want to echo my appreciation for being invited here. I already have a page full of notes from these scholars. You know, my entry point is very personal for the March on Washington. I'm a fourth generation Washingtonian. My mother, my grandfather, my grandmother were able to walk to the March on Washington, and they've told me those stories since I was a little child. And this is an event which really is the pinnacle of our people's ability to be inspirational leaders on the global stage. Another story that always stuck out to me was a story of a person who was actually enslaved. His name was Sylvester McGee, and he was still alive during the March on Washington. The March on Washington was scheduled to take place exactly 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. He was 110 years old. And the closeness to the enslavement idea is something that is often lost, I think, when people think about the march. Now, the slogan during that year was to be free in '63. It was not civil rights in '63. It was freedom that they were asking for, because in many ways, what they were experiencing during the Jim Crow period was not just the legacy of enslavement, but many of the same mechanisms of economic oppression and the stigma of segregation were in place that had been put in place initially, if not during enslavement, during the period right after Reconstruction, after the 1875 period that Professor Cottrell was talking about. So we call this the second Reconstruction period. And Dr. King's speech, I believe, also is a speech that is oftentimes framed as a civil rights speech. But if you look at the actual text of the speech, he begins by discussing this idea of African Americans being owed a promissory note, which was a sort of debt that was being denied to them, and when they sought to cash that check, it was returned with the statement, insufficient funds. And as we think about the current movement for reparations that has become so loud, and of course we have Prime Minister Motley herself, who is a champion of that, happening all across the region. I think we should re-examine the I Have a Dream speech and perhaps think about it more so as a cut the check speech, a reparation speech. Because the dream concept, to me, was not the first concept that was featured in the speech. The dream concept is a quick little story. There was a famous gospel singer named Mahalia Jackson who was at the speech. While Dr. King was talking, she called out and said, "Oh, tell him about the dream, Martin," right? She was a gospel singer. She had that spiritual connection. She could tell what was needed in the moment. And she had heard Dr. King talk about his dream in past speeches. So it was sort of an improvisational, spiritual connection that led to the I Have a Dream moment being brought before the world, and which was the concept that so many people think about first when they think about the I Have a Dream speech in the March on Washington. But if the actual initial drafting of that speech, to me, is more so centered on the promissory note concept and this idea of 100 years after enslavement, we still have not received any sort of repair and redress and healing. So for me, when I think about this anniversary, I think about this as a call to action to complete the call that was made 60 years ago based on the need for true freedom to be a reality in our country.
Thank you very much, Professor. You're hearing me, right? No. Yeah. But it's on. Okay, thank you so much for those remarks. And now we're going to go with our participant online, connecting from Trinidad and Tobago, Professor Tiloxin from West Indies University. You hear us? Can you share with us your first remarks, and then we're going to continue the dialogue?
Right. I am very honored to be here today, distinguished excellencies and guests. I'm really glad to share some sentiments. And I want to say that many of the socio-economic problems that were experienced by Blacks in the United States were also felt in the Caribbean. Black power was not something in just the Anglophone or English-speaking Caribbean. It was felt in the Spanish-speaking, Dutch-speaking, French-speaking Caribbean. So the words that Martin Luther King used in his speeches and his writings about the dispossessed, the downtrodden, the poor, the disenfranchised, it resonated throughout the Caribbean. It wasn't just confined to Trinidad and Tobago or the English-speaking Caribbean. So that Black power in the Caribbean was a direct offshoot of what was happening in the United States and also what was happening in Canada. There's also the Sir George Williams affair. And of course, Trinidadians were involved in both Canada and United States events. So this connection, it showed the transnational, the global connections, what was happening in the Caribbean. Also, there was Black power unfolding in London, in England. And what is very interesting is that Black power in the Caribbean in the late 1960s, early 1970s was very similar to the civil rights movement in the United States. It was this struggle to reclaim power, identity, respect, authority. It was an attempt to alleviate some of the socio-economic problems that did not disappear after independence. Some of the Caribbean countries had cut political ties with their European mother countries. in the 1960s and 1970s, but we were feeling the long effects of colonialism and imperialism. So we still had relatively high levels of poverty and unemployment throughout the Caribbean. So what was occurring in the United States was directly relevant and applicable not just to people of African descent in the Caribbean, but people from the working class and the lower classes in society. There was discrimination, religious discrimination, and racism still occurring. So it was something that people were trying to find solutions to.
Thank you very much, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the movement in my follow-up questions. But I'm going to go back to you, Carlos, and continue that point on the seeds being put there and then eventually spearheading movements for civil rights. And you know, using that analogy, can you share with us, and this would also be kind of your last question, the last opportunity to address the forum, so general comments about current activism for racial equality, of course linked to our aspirations for consolidation of democracy in the Americas, obstacles as well as strategies, and how the March continues to inspire those.
Thank you. I'm sorry, just putting this. Thank you very much. You know, I would say that after the 1980s, the Afro-Latino movement started to flourish, so to speak, and we found, especially in Brazil, we already have movements in Brazil, but at the international level, people were starting to talk about it. Once civil society organizations started to gather in different forums. I would like to remind that there has been 3 conferences against racism. The first one took place in 1978 in Geneva. The second one took place in 1983 in Geneva, and the third one took place in Durban in 2001. Those were opportunities where people were actually able to exchange strategies, to exchange points of view, to exchange what was going on in the region. One thing that I think it's important to mention, and it has to deal with the march and the civil rights movement in the United States, is that even though Mr. King was the force of an African-American movement at that time, his struggle was actually also for brown people, including the Latino community in the United States. You know, there were signs in the southwest of this country where it says that we don't serve Negroes, Latinos, or dogs. Not even Latinos, Mexicans or dogs. Those were the signs that were here. And so his struggle was basically for black and brown people. And that message actually also started to resonate at the international level, that racial discrimination was not a white and black thing exclusively, even though we have that issue in the United States and we had the apartheid in South Africa. So at the international level, there has been a movement, and unfortunately I would say that not very successful, so to speak, where we need to include the indigenous when we talk about racial discrimination in Latin America, or in the Americas, or in the world, that the UN Third Convention, the International Convention Against Racial Discrimination, that was signed in 1965, and then it came into force in 1969, it does include racism against the indigenous also as beneficiaries, so to speak, of that convention. Up till now, I think the indigenous movement, there has been a struggle, so to speak, try to convince the indigenous movement that the discrimination that they're facing is because of racial discrimination too. But having said that, there has been, and I'm not gonna take advantage of the next panel, they're gonna talk about things that have been happening, but I think in the Americas actually is the region that has been advanced more in terms of racial discrimination in the world for several reasons. One is that we finally recognize that we are multicultural countries. Before the 1990s, the majority of the constitutions in Latin America didn't recognize multiculturalism. So everybody was equal, even though you were in Native America, or indigenous, or black, everybody was Costa Rican, Venezuelan, Mexican, regardless of your origin. And that actually was kind of a curtain to discriminate against ethnic minorities, ethnic minorities. So After that recognition, so to speak, the different movements start to claim their specific rights. And this is a struggle that we are until now, but we are very, very happy, and I'm personally also sharing, like, since we're sharing a lot of personal things here, as Justin was saying, I'm very, very happy that we have an Inter-American Convention Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, and Related Forms of Intolerance that finally recognizes the different ethnic groups that live in the Americas, African, Afro-descendants, indigenous, Roma people in the region. And I'm also very happy that 6 countries of the Americas have ratified that convention, and countries are taking steps little by little in order to kind of fulfill the dream, as Mr. King was saying. And finally, to say that I was echoing Prime Minister of Barbados' words, that there's still a lot of things to do in the United States and and worldwide, and that's why I think it's important that, for instance, next year is the last year of the Decade of People of African Descent, and we know, because the members of the working group, the Permanent Forum, are working on that we are trying to look for a second decade of people of African descent, because the debt that we had towards people of African descent has not been fulfilled yet at the international level.
Thank you, Carlos, for opening the lens, in terms of other forms of racial inequality that characterize our hemisphere, and also the angle of the Latino movement in the United States. So thank you so much for those points, and definitely as at the Department of Social Inclusion, we're also working and joining efforts always with Race and Equality and other organizations and our member states to promote the contents of this Inter-American Convention Against all forms of discrimination. I'm going to go back to you, Professor Cottrell, and as I said, perhaps looking back, and we're going to take advantage of that you're an expert, history expert, and an institution really on this topic, and share with us what insights can we draw from the March of Washington, especially in terms of activism, coalition building, advocacy, and that are still relevant, let's just say, for the movements and activism happening today.
Well, I think the challenge that we have, and I think this is a challenge that we have throughout the hemisphere, is to start thinking in new ways about the problem of race and about the problem of social exclusion. And I'm going to start with some examples in Latin America, and then try and come to an example where the United States, I think, needs to start thinking in very different ways. One of the issues, for example, that I think, despite tremendous progress, I think, since the year 2000, an issue that I think is still important in a number of nations in Latin America is the question of people who are of indigenous descent, but who are not necessarily culturally indigenous, which is, if we were to go to Peru, for example, and ask about indigenous people, we would say, well, hear people say, well, an indigenous person is a person whose first language is Quechua, who lives in a more or less discrete indigenous community, and we have X, Y, or Z program for that population. If you were to ask, what about the individual who wants to be a bank manager who is of indigenous descent, even though the person's first language happens to be Spanish, and we're afraid that that person may run into racial discrimination, not cultural discrimination, but racial discrimination, very often you might get a kind of blank stare on that as a kind of response. The other, I recall, getting into personal stories, I was in Porto Alegre in September, the summer after Brazilian Congress passed a very sweeping affirmative action legislation. I was addressing a group of Afro-Brazilians in my best Portuguese, I might add, they were saying, well, the medical schools are dragging their feet on affirmative action. And medical school in Brazil, as in most of Latin America, is an undergraduate field. One goes direct from high school to medical school. And so I asked, how common was it to have a lab science in the in the public high schools, not the private high schools, but the real difficulties in education are in the public high schools? And they said it was unheard of. Now, if you have people graduating from public high schools who are then going to medical school who've never had a lab science, they're going to have real difficulties. Are the medical schools being racist or exclusionary? Perhaps. You know, I don't necessarily want to let them off the hook. But there's a structural problem here. If you're not training people in the public schools to move on to the next level, which in this case is medical school and a heavy dose of science in the medical schools, then you're setting the stage for exclusion, and there doesn't have to be a racist in the room for that exclusion to occur. Now, to come to the United States, and where we sort of have blinders, I think our blinders have developed in our jurisprudence with respect to ways of dealing with racial exclusion and racial inequality. Principally, look at what we've done in the areas of affirmative action. We can't get away, I think, from the idea that, okay, if a group has been disadvantaged, systematically disadvantaged, there is more than ample justification for having special programs for that group. Here, I think the United States actually ought to look to Brazilian jurisprudence in terms of the question of affirmative action. In 2012, the Brazilian Supreme Federal Tribunal, the Brazilian nation's Supreme Court, heard an affirmative action case dealing with university admissions in the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul. There was a quota program for Afro-Brazilians and other traditionally excluded groups. The case was heard in 2010, and it was interesting that the Brazilian court was conducting a national town meeting on race. They invited everybody, all stakeholders from whatever point of view, to come before the court and make the case for and against affirmative action. Oral amicus briefs, which Brazilians called palestras. I was able to view this because you can get the actions of the Brazilian Supreme Court on YouTube. Use 21st century technology. And so it was a magnificent moment where everybody came in and weighed in from their perspective. Then it took, the Brazilian court considered the matter for some 2 years, and in 2012, in a decision written by Minister Ricardo Lewandowski of the Brazilian Supreme Court, came out with a magnificent decision. He said, the United States talks about diversity, and that's all very well and good. But we as Brazilians have to realize we have historic debts, historic burdens that we have placed on the Afro-Brazilian people that we as a nation have a responsibility to undo. We were the last nation to end slavery in the hemisphere. We practiced racial exclusion for most of the 20th century. This is a balancing of the scales. It's a matter of justice. And so basically the Brazilian court, the Lewandowski opinion, and it was a unanimous decision by the court, the Lewandowski opinion said, we are about the business of righting historical wrongs. That is what affirmative action is about. That's something our Supreme Court has never achieved, even with Bakke and certainly with the recent Harvard and North Carolina cases. So again, it's a matter of taking off certain blinders, certain failures to see. And I think we all have them, and we can all learn from each other. And certainly I think our jurisprudence has much to learn from the Lewandowski opinion put forward in 2012 by the Brazilian court.
Thank you, Professor. And this idea of learning, from the experiences that the various countries of the OAS are having and things that are implementing is very important. I just wanted to mention also that in this spirit, the Permanent Council this year also held a specific thematic session on advancing social justice that really was trying to generate this learning and this the exchange of lessons amongst countries. So that's a very good point on regional cooperation. I'm gonna go to you, Professor Hansford. You are a Washingtonian, U.S. citizen, of course, but you have a very important role in the UN Permanent Council for People of African Descent. So my last question to you before we start wrapping up this panel is how you see the impact of the March in conversations that are also happening at the global level.
The conversations that we've had so far at the Permanent Forum in many ways aspire to do something similar to what the March on Washington was able to successfully do. The March on Washington brought forth legislation on Capitol Hill and at the White House. The Permanent Forum hopes to push forward international agreements, so we have some tangible outcomes that we aspire to. The March on Washington famously was a coalition between faith-based movements, youth movements, unions, all of these different movements coming together, sort of an intersectionality of movements to come to agreements. It's messy sometimes. Not everybody gets the stage when they want to, but ultimately the goal is to build a coalition where you're stronger together than you would be apart. And the Permanent Forum is nothing other than a huge coalition. We had over 900 different participants in New York in June, about 700 in Geneva in December. And we have people participating online from around the world, civil society members from around the world, also seeking to build a coalition and try to move forward some sort of tangible outcome that would also touch on some of the core material realities. And I think that's the third similarity. If you look at the March on Washington for Jobs and Justice, economics was always there. Dr. King, of course, then went on to lead a poor people's movement and focus again on the material realities of inequality in the United States. For the Permanent Forum, one of our mandates is to document the disparities, the material disparities that we see throughout the diaspora, including Latin America and the Caribbean, Europe, wherever people of African descent live, and to have disaggregated data that can demonstrate the need for this type of documentation and ultimately legislation. And that's something that, if there's one thing I could wish that we had more of in the hemisphere, is disaggregated data where you specifically detail what is the state of the Afro population in this country on education, on healthcare, on jobs, on access to clean water, separate and apart from the whole country's progress towards, say, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals. What is the progress for people of African descent towards the Sustainable Development Goals in your country? We see in this hemisphere and around the world a lack of the keeping of disaggregated data so that we can change material realities. So those are some of the things that we have in common. Of course, we're a long way from being the March on Washington in terms of I think there were 250,000 participants on that one day. And so we have about 249,000 more participants to go. But I do think that eventually, because we're using this global platform and we have the ability to use technology and we have the legacy of the March on Washington to build on, that the Permanent Forum will be a tool for progress for years to come.
Excellent. Thank you so much for those points. And we're now going back to Trinidad and Tobago. Professor T. Loxing, with your last remarks, I wanted to ask you if you had to summarize the key achievements and lasting legacies of the Black Power movement in the Caribbean, but really looking in terms of what is the pending agenda as we move forward. That's going to be the perfect segue to our next panel. You have the floor.
I want to start off to say that this march to Washington didn't start off in isolation. I know one of the earlier speakers talked about the issue of slavery 200 years ago, but we also have to remember too that many Caribbean personalities were involved in this build-up, this momentum that led to this march to Washington. And some of these persons have played major roles in Pan-Africanism, Garveyism, Black internationalism. We have people of Caribbean descent who were part of the 1960s in United States, and these include Stokely Carmichael of the Black Panther Party, who's a graduate of Howard University. Malcolm X, his mother is from Grenada, a small island in the Caribbean. And we have Caribbean communities in New York, especially in the Harlem period, that took part in this march. So there's a strong Caribbean connection. And what I've realized from some of the legacies of the Black Power movement is that it challenged the status quo. It challenged the establishment, the conventional politics. It challenged the economic control that multinational corporations had on the economy. And the radicalism of the 1960s, not just the Nation of Islam and Black Panthers, but the radicalism of other ideologies like socialism and communism and Marxism had infiltrated into the Caribbean, especially among the trade unions, so that we had one of the legacies being that the politics had changed, the economy had changed. We now had more Blacks owning businesses. We now had more Blacks being appreciative of their culture, and more Blacks also being appreciative of themselves. There was less of an inferiority complex. They were wearing their Afro hairstyles, their dashikis, they were learning their African languages. So there was this attempt to understand their identity. Regarding the way forward in the 21st century, unfortunately, I have seen some forms of regression. Here in Trinidad and Tobago, we have a very high murder rate, sometimes crossing 500 murders every year for the last 6 to 7 years. Here in the Caribbean, as you know, we have racism, gender discrimination. We have racial profiling, just as you all have in the United States. And what is very strange is that here in the Caribbean, many Caribbean countries copy what is happening in the United States. We look at you all as a developed country, as a sort of role model. And because of the increase in murders, we are also debating in our parliament about stand your ground laws, the same stand your ground laws that you all have in the United States. We are discussing it. Our politicians, the public is discussing it in Caribbean countries like Trinidad and Tobago. So it's very interesting to see that in the 21st century, despite having independence, despite being a republic, we are still in that mindset, that psyche. And I believe it's very difficult to distinguish, achievements and legacies when we have these problems. We still have relatively high levels of poverty and unemployment. We still have brain drain. Many of our young, talented minds, they are leaving to go to developed countries. So, it's difficult to stand back and boast of some of these legacies and boast of these achievements when I see these negative problems. Even something as simple as clean water, something as simple as turning on the tap. Many people don't have that access to pipe-borne water here in the Caribbean. So I think it is something that needs to be considered. We need to examine this very word achievement. What does achievement mean? What is a legacy? Is it a cosmetic legacy, a cosmetic achievement? Is it a hollow achievement that has problems in it? And that would be my final closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Professor, and I think you've done a very nice context for our next panel, which is actually going to take a look at that pending agenda, but also ways and strategies that we can continue this fight. I want to thank all of you for joining this first panel, all of those connected online, but especially I want to ask for a round of applause for our panelists today. Thank you very much. Gracias.
Thank you all. Thank you all. It was a very interesting exchange there. We all have come away with quite a bit more information and background and understanding of this process and the implications that this movement has had. So we're going into another panel discussion, and I suspect that since there are different people, the names will be changed. Okay. Yeah, so the names are going to be changed because the next panel, so thank you all panelists from panel number 1. Yes, so I was particularly interested in everything each one said and the historical backdrop to some of why we are where we are today. So the next panel will look at the efforts to address racial discrimination, all forms of discrimination and intolerance to date. And as we said earlier, you can't just give you can't just give a description of the problem. You have to say, how do we get there? And so the way forward, those will be some of the issues addressed by the next panel that comprises His Excellency Ambassador Noel Lynch, Permanent Representative of Barbados to the OAS and to the United States. He's Ambassador to the United States. Soledad Garcia Munoz, Special Rapporteur on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And she also, like Ambassador Lynch, will be in person. And yes, so welcome. I think you can start approaching the podium, Ambassador Lynch. Not the podium, your seat. The platform I meant. And where's Ms. McCauley? Is she? Oh, she's virtual. She's virtual. And Pastor Murillo. And by the way, his first name is Pastor Murillo. So he's not a pastor, so far as we know. And he's a member of the United Nations Permanent Forum of Peoples of African Descent, and he'll be speaking virtually. And by the way, Ms. McCauley, who will be speaking virtually as well, she's the rapporteur on the rights of persons of African descent and against racial discrimination, also under the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And this session will be moderated by the very able Roberto Rojas, who is with the unit and department dealing with groups in situations of vulnerability here at the OAS Secretariat. And of course, he's in person. So, Roberto, it's in your hands now, sir.
Ok, ¿me escuchan? Sí. Bueno, voy a hablar en español para dar balance a los paneles. En primer lugar, quiero felicitar a la misión de Estados Unidos y agradecer a todos los coorganizadores por este importante evento. Creo que, y voy a hacer una reflexión antes de pasar hasta nuestros panelistas, yo no estaría sentado frente a ustedes sin el impacto en mi vida del reverendo Martin Luther King, ya que yo hago parte de lo que se denomina el movimiento afroperuano. Pude fundar una organización de jóvenes cuando era más joven, no decir hace cuánto, en donde pudimos reivindicar nuestros derechos, y obviamente una de nuestras referencias fue el pastor Martin Luther King, y después cuando decidí ser un abogado de derechos humanos también, obviamente su presencia fue muy importante en mi vida. Quiero iniciar este panel presentando a nuestros expositores, que son expositoras también, que son muy importantes en muchas de sus especialidades. El embajador Lynch, que es representante permanente de Barbados ante la OEA, la relatora especial de los DESCA, de la CIDH, Soledad García Muñoz, la relatora de Derecho de Afrodescendientes de la CIDH, Margaret McCullen, y el pastor Murillo, un viejo amigo, no por la edad, sino por los años que nos conocemos, miembro del Foro Permanente de Afrodescendientes de Naciones Unidas. Quiero empezar con el embajador Lynch, específicamente teniendo en cuenta el rol de Barbados y el CARICOM en este movimiento por reparaciones. ¿Cómo Barbados y el CARICOM ha colaborado con otras naciones para poder impulsar las reparaciones a nivel regional?
Well, first of all, thank you. I'm going to begin by stating that you presuppose that I spoke Spanish, right? And that que yo entiendo español. You thought so. Okay, I'm not that sure. But just let me begin by thanking you first for the opportunity to be here this morning and to speak upon this particular topic. I want to thank also the Permanent Mission of the U.S. and the Organization of American States for convening this panel. And like Prime Minister Motley of Barbados said so eloquently this morning, that this march creates issues in our mind whenever we speak about racial justice or equality that cannot be erased. The March on Washington itself was not only about the United States. It was fundamentally about issues related to equality or inequality all over the world. And it became a clarion call for people, underdeveloped people or disadvantaged people all over the world to look to how they could better reshape their lives. Now, in that regard, the march was not only about race. The march fundamentally was about justice. It was about justice, and it was about jobs, it was about freedom. And I think many people forget that the march was also the precursor to two pieces of legislation that were passed in the U.S. That was passed under President Johnson. Not only the Civil Rights Act that many people talk about, but the Economic Opportunity Act that really created jobs and really created an opportunity for the Jobs Corps and the community action that led to movements to eliminate poverty. But as I speak, 2023 is 10 years that in the Caribbean we have started a permanent commission and a ministerial subcommittee, prime ministerial subcommittee on the issue of reparations. Now, many people hearing reparations or talk about reparations believe that this is some money grab. Not to be vulgar, but people thought that when you first started to talk about reparations, many people said, well, what's this about? This is about paying people back for past deeds, etc. Reparations is really about repairing the historical legacy of underdevelopment in the region that led and are directly linked to native genocide. That is the genocide of the indigenous people of the that is the genocide of the indigenous people of the Caribbean and people of African descent who were enslaved in the Caribbean. So it's not about writing a blank check to anyone. What it is about is repairing the historical legacy of underdevelopment in the Caribbean that led to that genocide of indigenous Caribbean people. Now, I will say that living in the United States has exposed to me a different attitude in terms of how I view the United States and the government's response to the issues of racial inequality and inequity in the US. Now, I've always said, and not to make light of it, that when I leave the United States, I have a country to return to that's 98% black. But even as we speak about the US, one of the issues that must be dealt with in this context is the whole issue of systemic racism that continues to exist within the fold of this country. Now, I am one who, I've never actually had blatant racism or blatant acts of bigotry exhibited to me. And that's maybe because of the cocoon that I live in and the places where I frequent and where I am. But the issue of being able to eliminate all of the pockets of systemic racism is really going to help to move the movement forward. Now, we can't live in a country in which people are still, in many ways, underdeveloped in the most powerful country in the world. And when I look through all that is happening in the US, I sometimes relate it much to my country and what's happening in my country. Because if you believe that there's not bigotry and some form of racism in the Caribbean, you're fundamentally mistaken. And that's why the issues of reparations become so important. I'll say one other thing finally. The reparations movement in Barbados and the Reparations Commission and the Caribbean Commission has just had a meeting with the European Union. And the European Union has, for the very first time, admitted that, that they apologize, first and foremost, apologize for the issues of African slavery, of African enslavement. They have committed and made it abundantly clear that they want to be part of a wider global reparations movement that must repair all of the injustices that we had. So I think we are making strides. As I said, this is 10 years commemorating the reparations movement establishment in the Caribbean. It's a movement that has now become global. It's a movement that I think that Latin America should also embrace, because there are many issues, and it begins with education and clearly understanding the issues of reparations and what reparations is all about. I'll stop there.
Ambassador, Soledad, ¿qué representa Martin Luther King para ti y cómo en tu trabajo como relatora de DESCA lo tienes en el presente?
Muchas gracias. Esa es la pregunta mágica para mí en esta jornada. Muy buenos días. Good morning, everyone. I will speak in Spanish too. Let me to thanks a lot for the opportunity to be here and to congratulate this really important event. Muchas gracias a la misión de Estados Unidos de América, embajador. La verdad que significa tanto, Roberto, que preparé lo que quiero decir para no olvidarme de nada, porque para mí tiene un significado excepcional, y más ahora que estoy cumpliendo en estos días 6 años de comenzar la andadura y cerrando un mandato como relatora especial sobre derechos económicos, sociales, culturales y ambientales de la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos, que ha estado iluminado desde su primer día por el legado, por la obra, por el pensamiento del doctor Martin Luther King y por el combate de la discriminación en todas sus formas, muy especialmente la racial, la étnico-racial, gracias en gran medida a la alianza y el aprendizaje constante con mi querida y admirada sister, Margaret May Macaulay, quien también va a estar en esta sesión. Ella me ha enseñado mucho sobre la urgencia de combatir la discriminación racial y también de trabajar por el Caribe, para la efectiva protección de los DESCA. Le quiero dar un abrazo a la presidenta virtualmente y agradecerle por todo su apoyo, por toda su confianza. Ella está en Jamaica ahora. Y hablando del Caribe, si hoy me piden pensar en un país que me desvela por los niveles de pobreza y discriminación, es Haití. ¿Y qué creen que diría y haría el Dr. King frente a la situación de ese pueblo tan hermoso y tan sufriente? ¿Qué creen que haría, que pensaría frente a tantas y tan graves injusticias como existen en nuestro precioso hemisferio, en su país, en un contexto de destrucción del planeta como nunca antes había conocido la humanidad? Seguro que, como yo, pueden imaginarse su indignación y sus clamores. Recuerdo muy bien que desde mi primera intervención ante el Consejo Permanente de esta organización, la voz del Dr. King estuvo presente con un pensamiento que me ha acompañado como aspiración constante en el camino fundacional de la Redesca. Tengo la audacia de creer que los pueblos de todo el mundo pueden tener 3 comidas al día para sus cuerpos, educación y cultura para sus mentes, y dignidad, igualdad y libertad para sus espíritus. En el hemisferio más desigual del planeta, no porque no haya riqueza, sino porque está muy mal, pero muy mal distribuida, el pensamiento y la obra del Dr. King, la necesidad de ser audaces que él nos inspira, tienen más que nunca vigencia. Esta 60 marcha de Washington, como muy bien lo dijo el embajador, no es una marcha solo para Washington, como muy bien lo explicaba el doctor en el previo panel, es una marcha global, planetaria. Debe llevarnos también a conmemorar el trabajo de la OEA, el trabajo del Sistema Interamericano de Derechos Humanos. En 1963, la OEA cumplía 15 años de creada y la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos sus primeros 4 años de andadura. Qué importante ha sido el trabajo de esta organización, como el de la Comisión, como el de la Corte Interamericana de Derechos Humanos, para avanzar en la agenda de derechos, de justicia social, racial y antidiscriminación que el Dr. King y su legado representan. Como representa también lo peligroso que resulta ejercer el derecho a defender derechos. Por eso el Dr. King fue asesinado, y lo son tantas y tantas personas valientes que defienden derechos en nuestra región, la más peligrosa del mundo para defender los derechos ambientales. Quiero hoy muy humildemente dedicar a la memoria del Dr. King el legado que dejan estos 6 años de andadura de la Redesca, en cuyo centro ha estado el sueño de hacer efectiva la indivisibilidad e interdependencia de todos los derechos humanos en el sistema interamericano. Porque ese ha sido el centro de mi visión como relatora especial, traer la perspectiva de indivisibilidad e interdependencia al centro de todos los mecanismos de la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos, dando a los DESCA, a los derechos económicos, sociales, culturales y ambientales, porque como muy bien lo dijo, la economía está en todo esto de lo que hoy hablamos, el lugar que merecen, porque no son derechos de segunda generación, son derechos de primera categoría y de primera necesidad para hacer realidad el derecho a vivir libres de terror, libres del temor y libres de miseria. Como saben, esta relatoría ha sido la segunda que ha puesto en marcha la Comisión en toda su historia para impulsar una agenda impostergable de derechos. El agua, la alimentación, los derechos laborales, los derechos sindicales, la vivienda, la educación, la seguridad social, el medio ambiente y temas centrales, medulares para la agenda de los derechos humanos hoy y siempre. La pobreza, la cuestión de las políticas fiscales y económicas, la cuestión de las empresas y los derechos humanos, la cuestión de la emergencia climática, el derecho humano a la salud, a través de un enfoque transversal, un enfoque interseccional que abogue por la igualdad de género y la diversidad en nuestro hemisferio. Trabajar de manera interseccional y poniendo acento en la situación de las mujeres no es opción. Trabajar en relación con los DESCA de todos los colectivos en situación de vulnerabilidad en las Américas no es opción. Y cuando pensamos en colectivos en situación de vulnerabilidad tenemos que tener un amplio pensamiento. Tenemos que pensar muy especialmente en las personas que viven en la pobreza o en la calle. Y no tenemos que irnos muy lejos para verlas. Tenemos que pensar en las personas que están en movilidad humana y por qué esas personas se ven forzadas a irse de sus hogares. Tenemos que pensar en la infancia, en el campesinado, en las personas LGTBIQ+, en las defensoras y defensores, en las personas privadas de libertad, en las personas con discapacidad. Y muy especialmente tenemos que pensar en la perspectiva antirracista aplicada al trabajo de los derechos humanos. Y es por eso que este año hemos tenido la oportunidad de hacer varias visitas de las que ahora les voy a hablar con esa mirada antirracista. Y es por eso, voy a ir terminando.
La segunda parte, precisamente nos interesa escucharte hablar de eso. ¿Te parece?
Entonces, solo déjenme que termine esta primera parte. Pensé que mi intervención iba a ser continua, por eso estaba dando ese hilo. Pero hablar de la importancia del trabajo con la comisionada Macaulay, que creo que va a hablar ahora, en cuanto a los DESCA de las personas afrodescendientes en las Américas. Porque como bien se ha estado diciendo, no por nada, las personas afrodescendientes, las personas indígenas, son las que soportan más que ninguna la pobreza en este hemisferio. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, disculpa, pero ya estamos contra el tiempo, pero en la segunda parte puedes terminar tu idea. Margaret, es un placer verte de manera virtual, un abrazo fraterno. ¿Puedes contarnos cuál es tu experiencia como una mujer caribeña de viajar por toda la región, viendo la realidad de las personas afrodescendientes en tu rol como relatora para afrodescendientes y contra la discriminación racial de la CIDH?
Thank you very much. But let me first say good morning to everyone, and that this is indeed a pleasure, honor for me to participate in such a notable panel, and on the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington, D.C., which was such an historic event, and it reminds us all over the world, of the fight of civil rights activists to advocate for racial justice, and whose Martin Luther King's whose speech touched our minds, hearts, and consciences, and made me into a human rights defender that I am. But my best wishes to all the speakers, colleagues, and I thank especially Mr. Luis Amado, Secretary General of the OAS, for hosting this very important event. And I warmly greet and hug my sister, Soledad Garcia Munoz, our special rapporteur, who we will miss very, very much. My experience as a rapporteur, well, firstly, I joined the Inter-American system as a judge of the Inter-American Court in 2006 when I was elected as the judge. And to date, I am the only Caribbean, English-speaking, Black woman who has been elected to such a position. Now, I don't think I need to make any further comment on that. You can each draw your own conclusions why there has been another to date. I found the experience of 6 years I spent as a judge of the court extremely enlightening. And though we did not do many cases on Afro-descendant populations and communities, we did do some. And the Saramaka case is a very important one. And so I got the baptism of water with their cases for in a case related to their land rights, lands which had been occupied for centuries and which had been taken um, for development of a reservoir, and they were displaced and put in um, houses which were not even a tenth as comfortable as their huts. They had thatched roofs which kept their buildings cool, but these things which were put in replacement in an arid area were tin roof and extremely hot and without utilities, as you should have electricity and so on. And that made me very avid in wanting to find and visit the people. And but I spent 6 happy years, how to report it, administering justice as a judge. And when I left there, and a few years later, I was elected as a commissioner to the Inter-American Commission at the suggestion of the government of Jamaica. And I became a commissioner in 2016. Anyway, I'm on my 8th year and my final year. And Martin Luther King had influenced me. I found after, I didn't mean to plagiarize, but you know, when somebody really influences your mind, you sometimes speak, and after the event, when you hear or read something you've said, then you realize, oh, that saying must have come from one of his speeches or his speech, and so on. Because my first speech of the commission, I spoke about, as the rapporteur of Afro Descendants' rights in the Americas, that what I had discovered in the years I've been in the inter-American system of human rights is that Afro descendants were still suffering enslavement in so many ways. And so I made my public speech by making a promise that I would, as the commissioner and the rapporteur, bring a bright light to shine on the violations being committed by states in not affording their African citizens, African descendant citizens, the full rights to be equal with the rest of the population. And as we know, has been mentioned, in Brazil, the Afro descendant population is larger, it's the largest group in the country. And in Colombia, there are over 12 million Afro descendant persons and so on. And I do not know of any country within the Americas where there are not Afro persons of African descent. And so, therefore, it was for me a simple, clear, and straightforward picture that at this time, we have to afford persons of African descent equal rights that filled with equitable practices, the opportunities that are enjoyed by the white population, or so described population, in relation to education, medical services, right to hold their lands and titles to it, right to not to have their lands poisoned through mining contracts to which they did not consent to be done on their lands, and um, all other opportunities, and of course the right to share in all levels of power within the state, which was not so. In fact, one of the things I found, much to my shock, was a number of countries did not even count the Afro descendant population at that time in their population census. So I was really struck by the fact that we had to work very hard. And I must say this, I'm saying publicly, I thank Carlos Casada, who spoke before, the director and founder of Race and Equality Institute, who assisted and still assists the rapporteurship in achieving some of the work which we were able to do in so many states around the region. And in taking us Inter-American Commission, myself and my team, who happened to be one person, was an expert, to travel around and meet and learn directly from Afro-descendant people. And one of the things we learned is that their rights were being continuously violated, that they were living in most countries as invisible persons, and that they could not, in many instances, practice their religion, their African religion, and in every way they were discriminated against in the labor market, in schools that they managed to get into, and universities and colleges, and that they were it was a life of, to my mind, enslavement, and highly, highly this discriminatory against them as a people. So it became a passion for me to work with them. But there has been improvement. Lots of the states have focused on changing laws within their states, of making opportunities available which were not available before. But yet, in recent years, there are the regressive states.
Margaret, we have some technical issues, so we are moving to Pastor Murillo, and we try to fix that. Okay.
So therefore, there.
Yeah. Sorry. Okay. Pastor Murillo.
Gracias, Roberto. Para mí también es un motivo de orgullo participar en esta celebración. Gracias a la OEA y al gobierno de los Estados Unidos por la iniciativa. Sin duda alguna, la marcha de Washington sigue teniendo un impacto muy importante en el profesor y otros son de ser partícipes de este momento histórico tan importante. En mi caso, bueno, yo nací justo en agosto de 1963, de manera que ese continuo histórico y ese impacto duradero de la marcha de Washington, pues es lo que estamos cosechando muchos de los actores que estamos involucrados en la lucha contra el racismo. Discriminación racial. Diría que los efectos y los impactos son evidentes y que hoy más que nunca tenemos la oportunidad de constatar que la cuestión del racismo y la discriminación racial tiene una centralidad muy importante en la cuestión de los derechos humanos. De hecho, las demandas de reparación, por ejemplo, en favor de los afrodescendientes, son quizás, o es quizás el tema que va a marcar la agenda global, la agenda del siglo XXI. En esa medida, creo que hay que reconocer también que han habido avances muy importantes, particularmente en esta segunda y tercera década del siglo XXI, porque recordemos que si bien es cierto,
con la conferencia de Durban, hubo una manifestación, un rechazo universal contra el racismo y la discriminación racial. Infelizmente, los atentados de la Torre Gemela derivaron en que la década entre el 2000 y 2010 fuera una suerte de década perdida, digamos, en la lucha contra el racismo, porque el foco se centró en el combate al terrorismo. Hoy hay un entendimiento que los asuntos relacionados con la identidad, con la raza, con el género, tienen un lugar central en las agendas globales, y en lo que concierne específicamente al combate al racismo y discriminación racial, estamos en un momento paradójico. De una parte, creo sinceramente que ha habido un incremento muy notorio de la conciencia colectiva global. La conciencia antirracista ha avanzado de manera muy positiva ahora en los últimos años, más que en ningún otro momento de nuestra historia. Y esto llegó, diría, a un punto de inflexión con ocasión del asesinato de George Floyd en los Estados Unidos, pero también recordemos que esa sensibilidad que se expresó tras el asesinato de George Floyd, detrás de ella estuvo también los impactos derivados del COVID-19, donde la ciudadanía pudo constatar que los impactos desproporcionados del COVID, por ejemplo, en la población afrodescendiente, afroamericana, primero en Estados Unidos, afrodescendiente en muchos otros países, estaba íntimamente relacionado con las desventajas históricas, con los hechos del pasado. Y eso generó una sensibilidad que luego se expresó de manera elocuente con el asesinato de George Floyd y que creo que está allí flotando. Tenemos el desafío de movilizar y garantizar la sostenibilidad de esa conciencia colectiva global. Pero también tenemos el desafío de observar cómo la cuestión del racismo y la discriminación racial, por ejemplo, en virtud a los impactos asociados, impactos disruptivos de la inteligencia artificial, está derivando en formas contemporáneas de racismo y discriminación racial que debemos atacar, que debemos atender. Es importante constatar también la instrumentalización política del racismo y la discriminación racial y cómo está desafiando la paz y la seguridad internacionales, cómo las democracias hoy están seriamente amenazadas, y detrás de esto está la instrumentalización de la xenofobia, el uso, digamos, de los migrantes como chivo expiatorio. De manera que tenemos pues en esta temática y en las palabras de Martin Luther King, en las acciones de Martin Luther King, una fuente de inspiración para observar el momento histórico bajo ese lente que nos señalaba al comienzo el profesor Carlos Quesada, cómo mirar que en la coyuntura, en el contexto actual, ese es uno de los desafíos más importantes que afronta la sociedad en su conjunto. La constatación de que la paz y la seguridad internacionales pasan por la atención que pueda tener, la respuesta que pueda tener la sociedad a los problemas de racismo y discriminación racial. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Pastor. Estamos con el tiempo. Lamentablemente no vamos a tener otra ronda de preguntas. Simplemente les voy a pedir en un minuto a nuestros expositores si pueden complementar su intervención anterior, por favor. Embajador Lynch.
Just let me say that I want to return to very quickly to a theme that was raised earlier by one of the panelists, I think, the learned professor that sat here. You know, there's so many de facto discrimination policies that disproportionately affect people of color, intended or unintended, here in the U.S. We don't only import from the U.S. inflation and products and whatever, we also import many of the practices that happen here. And I believe that when he said that if you focus only on the end of Dr. King's speech, that is the part about the dream, you really delude yourself about some of the issues. It's a dangerous illusion that many of us have fallen for, and by focusing on the dream alone, you get away from anything to address past misdoings. And the past misdoings are what we need to focus on. Dr. King said, in a sense, we have come to the nation's capital to cash a check. And that check was focused on having insufficient funds. But one of the things that leads me to is what is happening in the region. I believe that it is important that the U.S. show more leadership as it relates to the development of countries within this hemisphere. My favorite topic is Haiti. I find it unbelievable that in the 21st century, that Haiti can be living through what it is living through without larger countries in this hemisphere stepping up to the plate and ensuring that Haiti is better looked after than it is looked after today. Any space for underdevelopment in this hemisphere affects everyone else in this hemisphere. And when you have situations where people are crossing the Darien Strait every day, the Darien Gap, and dying to get to the United States, there are people at the border. Why is that? Not necessarily that they're fleeing to get to a place where there's a better living. If they had a better living where they were, the probability of them not moving would never be so. But what's happening is that we need to create in our minds the concept that we are all in this together. These are the people that are going to end up on our doorstep if we don't do more. The larger, better developed countries in the region that must speak to the issues of reparations, must speak to the issues of repairing these misgivings. We are going to have challenges on our doorstep. We're going to have drugs moving towards us. We're going to, like how the fentanyl is coming up, and you know where it's coming from. Unless you do more to address some of the fundamental areas of underdevelopment, not just focusing primarily on having an election every 4 or 5 years. Democracy is important, human rights are important, but you cannot have democracy and human rights unless you have development. Social and economic development are at the base, is the platform on which we need to build democracies, build better human rights. And I'm making this call. Haiti has been paying the price for being the first country that had the strength and the backbone to stand up to racial inequality and slavery. And I believe they've been paying the price ever since. They've paid back 200 years of reparations to France. How could that be? And these people are suffering today. And what we need to do, I'm making this call from this platform, for us to do more, the larger countries in this hemisphere, to do more to correct the situation in Haiti. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Soledad, un minuto, por favor.
3 ideas. La primera, muy relacionada con lo que el embajador acaba de mencionar, y es que en realidad derechos humanos y desarrollo son las dos caras de una misma moneda. Y tenemos que reivindicar muy claramente el derecho humano al desarrollo sostenible, no como el mero crecimiento económico, como le hemos dicho en nuestro informe sobre empresas y derechos humanos, sino como el bienestar de las comunidades, como el fin último, primero, existencial de esto que llamamos democracia, y por supuesto la protección del planeta como la máxima emergencia que tenemos en el momento que estamos viviendo. Y en ese sentido iba a hablar antes de cómo hemos constatado ciertamente el patrón de discriminación étnico-racial en este continente a lo largo de nuestro trabajo y de nuestras visitas. Algunas de ellas gracias además a la aquiescencia histórica del gobierno de Estados Unidos a través de su misión en la OEA, y quiero agradecerles muchísimo que nos ha permitido este año visitar Los Ángeles para constatar la situación de las personas que viven en la calle allá, visitar Luisiana, visitar Alaska y constatar el daño atroz que está haciendo el cambio climático en las comunidades de primera línea, que no por casualidad son comunidades negras y comunidades indígenas. O también nos ha permitido ir a Brasil, también con la autorización del gobierno brasilero, invitados por organizaciones negras que nos hacían todo el tiempo entender que en realidad la población negra de Brasil es el 56% de la población brasilera y es lo llamaban mayoría minorizada. Entonces quiero en esta primera idea llamar a la urgencia de poner la dimensión étnico-racial al centro de la comprensión de lo que significa defender derechos humanos, y en segundo lugar decir que defender derechos humanos hoy pasa por defender el derecho humano al desarrollo sostenible, pasa por entender que vivimos en sociedades racistas, machistas, LGTBI-fóbicas, aporófobas, si me permiten la palabra, el odio a la pobreza, y es precisamente esos sistemas de dominación que tenemos que tener y reconocer para llegar a mi tercera y última idea, que es la esperanza. Porque el Dr. King nos trae un sueño y también nos trae un mensaje de esperanza cuando nos dice: todavía hay esperanza para un mañana más brillante. Muchísimas gracias.
Hello?
Ahora sí. Por los problemas técnicos que tenemos con conectar a Margaret y a Pastor, porque aquí en el salón no se ha escuchado muy bien sus intervenciones, en 30 segundos, por favor, si pueden decir sus palabras de clausura. Lo lamento mucho,
Okay,
pero
thank you.
no nos ayuda mucho la tecnología esta vez.
Hello, can you hear me?
Sí, Margaret.
Thank you. I'll be very, very short. I just have 2 points to make. And that is that we at the Commission and in my rapporteurship, definitely, we recognize that economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights is a fundamental for racial justice to be a reality. And secondly, we, the states of the region, have to get up their duffs and ratify the 2 conventions against discrimination. The first against racism and racial discrimination and related forms of intolerance, and the second against racial discrimination against all such forms of intolerance. This could be done before the decade ends. And I agree with Carlos Quesada that we need a second decade, because the states have to move on with the ratification of these 2 conventions and make clear their commitment, their political will to ensure that all peoples within their borders live a dignified, equal, equitable, and human rights respected at all times kind of life. We owe that to everyone at this time. And of course, we have to protect our planet and our region from the devastation and destruction through climate irresponsibility and environmental irresponsibility. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margaret. Pastor, 30 segundos, por favor.
Gracias, Roberto. Muy brevemente, invitar a los estados partes de la OEA y a otras partes interesadas a que se vinculen a la agenda del foro permanente sobre los afrodescendientes, que, por ejemplo, en materia de reparaciones, convoca a los estados del hemisferio a avanzar hacia una opinión consultiva ante la Corte Internacional de Justicia, orientada a determinar la responsabilidad de los estados en la trata transatlántica, la esclavización y la prolongación de sus consecuencias. Invitarlos a que se sumen a las iniciativas con miras a la implementación de un tribunal internacional de justicia a instancias de las Naciones Unidas que se ocupe de la cuestión de las reparaciones como un mecanismo adicional para fortalecer el marco jurídico en materia de reparaciones. Invitarlos a que se sumen a los esfuerzos tendientes a situar a la cuestión de Haití en el centro de las reparaciones de los afrodescendientes en las Américas. Y finalmente, invitarlos a que se sumen a la iniciativa de la Declaración Internacional sobre la Protección y la Prevención y el pleno respeto de los derechos humanos de los afrodescendientes, que se está en proceso de negociación a instancias del Grupo Intergubernamental de Durban de las Naciones Unidas. Por supuesto, incorporando y abordando ahí todas las dimensiones, incluidas los impactos disruptivos de la inteligencia artificial, que tiene la potencialidad de profundizar la desigualdad y están generando sesgo algorítmico en algunas circunstancias que afectan desproporcionadamente a los afrodescendientes. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Pastor. Muchas gracias a nuestras y nuestros panelistas. Un aplauso, por favor. Ian, the floor is yours.
Okay, let's see here. Okay, muchas gracias, Roberto. Muchas gracias, miembros del panel. We had a lot of thoughts exchanged there and some great ideas. But as usual, the clock has a way of exerting a certain amount of tyranny. So we have to make some adjustments here as we thank the panelists. We are reorganizing the closing remarks. So first we'll have Ms. Desiree Cormier-Smith, U.S. Special Representative for Racial Equality and Justice, who will speak first, and she's in person, and she'll be followed by the pre-recorded closing remarks from the Assistant Secretary General and President RFK Center for Human Rights. So, Ms. Cormier-Smith.
Thank you and good afternoon. We clearly needed more time for such a rich and robust discussion, but I want to commend my colleagues at the U.S. Permanent Mission to the OAS for putting this together, as well as our colleagues at the OAS and all of our partner organizations to help organize this important, timely, and rich discussion. My name is Desiree Cormier-Smith, and as our moderator introduced me, I am the State Department's first ever Special Representative for Racial Equity and Justice. I was appointed by the Secretary of State in June of last year to advance the human rights of members of marginalized racial, ethnic, and indigenous communities, including people of African descent. In this historic new role, I'm working to build global partnerships to combat systemic racism, discrimination, violence, and xenophobia globally through U.S. foreign affairs work. This also includes our efforts here at the Organization of American States, where I am especially pleased that the United States joined many partners this past March in adopting an important new declaration on social justice and equity in the Americas. Today's event is very much in the spirit of implementing that declaration, as well as the Declaration of Lima, approved by the 2022 OAS General Assembly in Peru. Colleagues and friends, the United States has a rich diversity that is a source of national strength and pride. However, practitioners, policymakers, and citizens alike cannot and should not ignore that the reality that our country, like too many others in this region and the world, continues to grapple with racism, xenophobia, and discrimination, as we have throughout our history. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. dedicated his life to combating these evils and called upon all of us to take corrective and collective action with the fierce urgency of now. In the United States, there is ongoing debate about the need to acknowledge the tragic and ugly parts of our history. As President Biden says, quote, "We can't just choose to learn what we want to know and what we should know. We should know the good, the bad, everything. That's what great nations do. They come to terms with their dark sides, and we're a great nation," end quote. We try to do this to lead by example. We are not the only country grappling with the lingering legacy of colonization and the transatlantic slave trade and how we tell those parts of our ugly history. We also recognize its impacts throughout the Americas, even as we seek to live up to the vision of equality that my country was founded upon but has never fully lived up to. As the Special Representative for Racial Equity and Justice, my mandate is twofold. First, to ensure U.S. foreign policy, processes, and programs protect and advance the human rights of members of marginalized racial, ethnic, and indigenous communities. And, again, to build global partnerships to combat systemic racism, discrimination, and xenophobia around the world. not because we have solved these challenges in the United States, but because we recognize that these are global challenges that will require coordinated and sustained global solutions. The work of pursuing racial equality and justice does not entail us admonishing or lecturing other governments. I believe it is important to approach this work with great humility, as we still have a lot of work to do in the United States to fully address the realities of systemic racism. I also think it's important to underscore that we are not the only country struggling with these challenges. To paraphrase former President Jimmy Carter, a great friend of the Americas and the OAS, why should our efforts and commitment to eliminate racism end at our borders? I have been asked by people who question the need for U.S. diplomats to focus on racism in other countries. Why should the State Department spend time, energy, and resources examining the effects of systemic racism and promoting equity in the Americas and around the world? Well, we know that systemic and structural racism makes societies less safe, less prosperous, and less democratic. Therefore, our hemisphere will be safer, more democratic, and more prosperous when we address the deep-rooted inequities caused by racism. The OAS and the Inter-American human rights system have critical roles to play in this fight. My government is committed to closing the gap between the promises of America and the reality on the ground for too many of our citizens, here at home and throughout the Americas. We have taken steps, and we continue to take steps, to acknowledge and address systemic racism and the scourge of white supremacy in our own country. On his very first day in office, President Biden signed Executive Order 13985, advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government, an ambitious, historic, whole-of-government equity agenda. As President Biden said, quote, "Advancing equity is not a one-year project, it's a generational commitment," end quote. To double down on his commitment to strengthen the federal government's ability to address the barriers that underserved communities continue to face, President Biden followed up with another executive order earlier this year entitled Further Advancing Racial Equity and Support for Underserved Communities Through the Federal Government. These efforts reflect the reality that we are facing an inflection point. Just as our country was faced with questions of self-identity during the civil rights movement, we find ourselves at another crossroads, now defined by polarization and distrust of government. This is also the case across our hemisphere. Today, my government is working to close gaps, to root out systemic racism baked into our laws, and to even the playing field, here at home, throughout the Americas, and around the globe, so that all people can be free to reach their full potential. Our bilateral agreements on racial and ethnic equality with Brazil and Colombia, and our agreements with Chile and Uruguay serve as models for our efforts throughout the hemisphere and globally. Diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility also stand as pillars of our bilateral relationships with Canada and Mexico. Through the Trilateral Working Group on Violence Against Indigenous Women and Girls, we work with government counterparts and Indigenous women leaders to address the high rates of violence against Indigenous women and girls and two-spirited individuals in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. In January, we signed the Declaration on the North American Partnership for Equity and Racial Justice with Mexico and Canada. As part of this effort, we will establish a trilateral racial equity and inclusion expert network that will facilitate the exchange of information on best practices and innovative strategies developed across our three countries to advance equity and racial justice in our public policies and societies. And in April, we were proud to support the mayor of Rio de Janeiro as he launched his global anti-racist cities network at the City Summit of the Americas in Denver, with cities across the Americas coming together to fight racism and share best practices for promoting equity and inclusion in municipal governance and planning. I was proud to join the mayor and other signatories in meeting with civil society just before that launch to urge leaders at all levels of our government to take action against racism and discrimination. In conclusion, I'd like to borrow from the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all God's children, end quote. This means fighting new threats of spreading authoritarianism right here in our own hemisphere, in countries where the rule of law is under threat. To respond effectively, we must continue to lead with diplomacy rooted in our most cherished inter-American democratic values, defending universal human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, championing opportunity for all, upholding universal human rights for all, respecting the rule of law consistent with our inter-American democratic charter, and treating every person with dignity. Though we've never fully lived up to those aspirations here in the United States, we must all continue to strive to make those ideals real for all. 60 years later from the March on Washington, we are still battling many of the same injustices Dr. King fought and died for. Colleagues and friends, together we can take the next big step in our collective journey towards liberty and justice and dignity for all, or we can squander it. If we do the latter, future generations will face an even wider inequality gap and greater political instability. This work is not easy, it is not quick, but I know it can be done. So for Dr. King, for John Lewis, and for all those who fought and died for a more just and equitable global society, one in which the race or ethnicity you happen to be born does not determine how long you live, we must march on with dogged determination. For, again, to end with the words of Dr. King, quote, "It would be fatal for the region to overlook the urgency of this moment." Thank you.
Some great food for thought there as Ms. Comey Smith gave those closing remarks. And we have two more closing remarks. They pre-recorded, they both. Kerry Kennedy, President, RFK Center for Human Rights, followed by the last one, Ambassador Nestor Mendez, the Assistant Secretary General of the OAS, both pre-recorded, so they'll run one after the other.
Hi, I'm Kerry Kennedy, and I'm president of Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights. I'm honored to join you here today. The 60th anniversary of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom is a moment of profound pride for the defenders of human rights in the Americas. It is also an opportunity for meaningful reflection on progress made and paths yet to be tread. In the last half-century since Martin Luther King died and shared his dream of racial justice with the world on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, brave people across our country have worked hard to bend the arc of the moral universe towards justice. It took too long, but after Dr. King's speech, the United States outlawed discrimination in public places and employment, and provided for the integration of schools and other public facilities. In eliminating forms of racial discrimination, U.S. practice aligned with one of the core values of the Charter of the Organization of American States. Over the coming decades, courageous and dedicated public servants, including my father, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, fought to eliminate barriers to equal opportunity by enforcing civil and human rights laws. Historic immigration reform in the 1950s that did away with racially motivated quotas further opened the door of American opportunity to people around the world. Today, the United States is more racially and ethnically diverse than ever before in the country's history, with close to 10% of the population identifying as multiracial. And by 2046, we will be a majority minority country. Yet, it would be wrong if we failed to also acknowledge that the deeper, more difficult work of equalizing opportunity remains unfinished. Yes, racial discrimination in law is now illegal, but deeply unjust racial disparities persist in practice, rooted in centuries of denial of racial equality. Black and Hispanic Americans are overrepresented among the population in poverty in the United States, and the gap in average net wealth between Black and Hispanic households and non-Hispanic white households is ever increasing. School segregation between Black and white students has returned to 1968 levels, even as the nation grows more diverse. And racially discriminatory policing and incarceration policies continue to wreak havoc on American families. My own organization, Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, fights to end human rights abuses in the United States criminal and immigration systems, including the specter of racial discrimination. In the United States, Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white people. Black people in immigration detention are 6 times more likely to be locked in solitary confinement than immigrants of other races. And Haitians and other immigrants are the targets of horrific violence from American immigration authorities. In 2021, I traveled to the US border at Del Rio, Texas, to witness close to 15,000 Haitians and other asylum seekers held for days in open-air pens at the US border of Mexico, denied access to medical and legal assistance, and restricted from a fair opportunity to apply for asylum. Lawyers at RFK Human Rights are now engaged in court cases, grassroots movements around the country to put an end to these practices. And the Organization of American States and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights have been essential partners in our pursuit of accountability for victims and survivors of these and other human rights abuses. Working together, we have engaged in constructive dialogue with the United States officials to pursue remedies for Americans of all races who have been victims of police violence and to create new policies to enact systemic change that will eliminate racially biased policing in the US criminal and immigration systems. I am grateful for the spirit of cooperation and possibility that marked today's gathering, and I am hopeful for the future that will be forged by our partnership together. Together, we can achieve Dr. King's dream of a country where all God's children, Black and white, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to hold hands and sing, "Free at Last."
Muy buenas tardes. Good afternoon, everyone. It is indeed an honor to bring closing remarks as we commemorate the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington, a march whose significance reverberates through time. In acknowledging the theme, the March on Washington, its legacy and impact in the Americas, the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. resonate just as deeply today as they did back in 1963. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. Dr. King's iconic I Have a Dream speech, delivered during that historic March on Washington, echoes in every corner of our Americas to this day, reminding us, ever painfully and vividly, that our work is not yet complete, that there is much still to be accomplished. We gather today unified and committed to confronting and eradicating the discrimination, racism, and civil rights abuses that people of African descent, indigenous peoples, and other minorities and disenfranchised groups continue to endure. While we at the Organization of American States march tirelessly forward in championing a world where all individuals, regardless of race, are secure in their human rights and empowered through inclusion and access. Today's discussions underscore a sobering truth. Declarations and resolutions are simply not enough. So much remains sadly unchanged, and the challenges are many and sometimes even seem more daunting. We are called, therefore, not only to remember and honor, but to inspire change for the better, to zealously pursue social, political, and economic empowerment for all. The time to act is now. This means fighting for equal access to quality education, health, services, justice, and economic opportunities. The role played by Dr. King and countless other unheralded heroes was monumental, not just in the United States, but also in the entire hemisphere and the world at large. And it helped to shape views and opinions and to galvanize people into action. The pervasive issues that rallied people in 1963 under the banner of jobs and freedom persist today. Racism and discrimination not only suppress economic empowerment, but starkly contradict social justice and the principles of democracy we hold dear and which are vital to true progress in society. The March on Washington reminds us that our strength lies in our unity, in the quality of collaboration between and among governments, and between all sectors of our diverse societies, including civil society, academia, the private sector, youth organizations, and every other stakeholder. It is an urgent call to action, a call that demands from us a resolute stand against all forms of discrimination and racism. Let me seize this opportunity to reiterate, indeed to emphasize, that as a hemispheric body, we, the Organization of American States, remain unwavering in our collective commitment to this noble cause. We will continue to act decisively, using our plans and programs of action as catalysts for tangible, meaningful change in our Americas. And so, I extend my heartfelt congratulations to the Permanent Mission of the United States to the OAS for this important initiative. Our special thanks also to the Secretariat for Access to Rights and Equity, the Department of Social Inclusion, and to each and every one of our partners who helped to coordinate this unique event. Today's discussion was undoubtedly enriched by the insights and contributions of all our speakers. Their interventions have beamed a light on the enduring impact of that extraordinarily courageous March on Washington, both in the United States and across the Americas. The thoughts exchanged here have fueled our shared aspiration for a future defined by equality. It is my sincere hope that every one of us, whether present here or joining us virtually, leaves this forum with a heart and mind stirred, enlightened, ready to act, and confident that we shall overcome. Thank you.
And indeed, that is the hope that the session today has been able to move the needle further and inspire us to keep marching forward in this endeavor so that at the end of the day, we shall all overcome. The Assistant Secretary General did the honors of thanking, but I just want to reiterate again some of the collaborators on this program. Of course, we have to give thanks to Betilde Munoz, who her Department of Social Inclusion, spearheaded this thing from the Secretariat, and the Permanent Mission of the United States to the OAS, Ambassador Mora, one of our opening remarks from Ambassador Mora, and all of the participants, because I believe today's exchanges will have helped us, including those who may not have understood certain elements, to now be better able and better equipped with information going forward. So we want to also acknowledge the stakeholders like the Ministry of Equality of Colombia, Ministry of Racial Equality of Brazil, the Inter-American Network of High Authorities on Policies for Afro-Descendant Populations, that's the RIAFRO, and the International Institute on Race, Equality, and Human Rights, that's Race and Equality, and they were represented here by the Executive Director, Mr. Quesada, the George Washington University Law School, the International and Comparative Law Program, Howard University, the King Center, and NAACP. And certainly, we want to thank everyone who made the time, all of the ambassadors, the missions that were represented, the individuals who came here representing whether your individual self or your institutions. Thank you for joining us. And right now, it is to say thanks, and we have one last video to play, and just to remind you there's refreshment outside afterwards, so enjoy the music.
I woke up this morning with my man.
And it was